Welcome to the complete and comprehensive timeline of Poppy Playtime, a journey through one of gaming's most disturbing and intricate horror narratives. From the innocent beginnings of a toy company to the nightmarish experiments that would seal its fate, this is the story of Playtime Company, told in chronological order with every detail, every tragedy, and every dark secret revealed. Settle in as we explore the decade-spanning saga that transformed childhood wonder into unspeakable horror. The story of Poppy Playtime begins not with monsters or experiments, but with a dream. In 1930, a man named Elliot Ludwig stood at a crossroads in his life. His marriage had just ended in divorce, the result of his relentless dedication to work and his all-consuming vision. But Ludwig was not deterred by personal loss. If anything, the dissolution of his marriage only strengthened his resolve to pursue his true passion, bringing joy to children through the magic of toys. Elliot Ludwig was described by those who knew him as a visionary, a creative genius whose imagination knew no bounds. He possessed an almost obsessive drive to create toys that were more than simple playthings. Ludwig wanted to craft companions, friends that would feel alive to the children who held them. This wasn't merely about profit or business success, though those would certainly come. For Ludwig, toy making was a calling, a way to touch the lives of children and create moments of pure happiness in an often difficult world. With this vision burning in his heart, Elliot Ludwig founded Playtime Company in 1930. The company started modestly, as most great enterprises do, but Ludwig's dedication and innovative designs quickly set Playtime Company apart from its competitors. He worked tirelessly, often staying at the factory until the early morning hours, perfecting designs and overseeing every aspect of production. His hands-on approach and refusal to compromise on quality earned Playtime Company a reputation for excellence. The early years of Playtime Company were marked by steady growth and increasing success. Ludwig's toys captured the imagination of children across the country, and the company's profits grew year after year. But Ludwig was never satisfied with simply maintaining success. He constantly pushed for innovation, for new designs that would surprise and delight. He wanted to create toys that felt more lifelike, more real than anything the market had ever seen. As the 1930s progressed into the 1940s, Playtime Company expanded its operation significantly. The small factory that Ludwig had started with grew into a massive industrial complex, a testament to the company's success and Ludwig's ambition. The factory became a landmark, a sprawling structure that housed not just manufacturing facilities, but also design studios, testing areas, and eventually much more sinister spaces that would remain hidden from public view. During this period of expansion, Ludwig began to assemble a team of talented individuals who shared his vision. Engineers, designers, and scientists joined Playtime Company, attracted by Ludwig's reputation and the opportunity to work on cutting-edge toy development. Among these recruits would eventually be individuals whose contributions would take the company in directions that Ludwig could never have imagined, directions that would ultimately lead to tragedy. The year 1949 marked a significant moment in Elliot Ludwig's personal life, though the full details would remain shrouded in mystery for decades. Ludwig had a daughter named Poppy, born on March 7th of that year. Little is known about Poppy's mother or the circumstances of her birth, but what is clear is that Ludwig adored his daughter. She represented everything he valued: innocence, joy, and the pure wonder of childhood. Tragically, Poppy Ludwig's life would be cut short. At some point during the 1950s, she passed away under circumstances that have never been fully disclosed. The loss devastated Elliot Ludwig in ways that those around him could barely comprehend. He'd already lost his wife to divorce, sacrificing his marriage for his work. Now he'd lost his daughter, the one person who represented his hopes for the future and his connection to the joy he sought to create for others. The death of Poppy Ludwig would prove to be the catalyst for everything that followed. In his grief, Elliot Ludwig became obsessed with a question that has haunted humanity since the beginning of consciousness. What if death didn't have to be final? What if there was a way to preserve the essence of a person, their consciousness, their very soul, beyond the limitations of mortal flesh? For a man with Ludwig's resources, vision and desperation, this question would evolve from philosophical pondering into active experimentation. In 1950, Playtime Company achieved what would be publicly celebrated as a breakthrough in toy design, but was privately something far more significant. The company created the first Poppy Playtime doll, a toy that was unlike anything that had come before. The doll was remarkably lifelike, with features and expressions that seemed almost human. It was sophisticated beyond any toy of its era, possessing what the company described as advanced interactive capabilities. But the truth behind the Poppy Playtime doll was far more complex and disturbing than the public could have imagined. The doll was not simply an advanced toy, it was an experiment, the first successful attempt at what would later be called the extract process. This process involved taking human remains, specifically the consciousness or essence of a deceased person, and transferring it into an artificial vessel. The first Poppy Playtime doll was, in fact, Elliot Ludwig's attempt to bring his daughter back to life. The process was not perfect. The consciousness that emerged in the doll was sophisticated and aware, but it was also fundamentally changed by its new form. The Poppy that existed in the doll retained memories and personality traits from Poppy Ludwig, but she was also something new, something that existed in the liminal space between human and artificial. She could think, feel, and communicate, but she was trapped in a body that would never age, never change, never die. For Elliot Ludwig, the creation of the Poppy doll represented both his greatest achievement and his deepest tragedy. He had found a way to preserve his daughter's consciousness, but at what cost? The being that existed in the doll was his daughter, yet also wasn't. She was aware of her condition, aware that she existed in a form that was fundamentally unnatural. The psychological and emotional implications of this existence would haunt both Ludwig and Poppy for decades to come. The success of the extract process, however limited and ethically questionable, opened up possibilities that Ludwig and his team could not ignore. If consciousness could be transferred into a doll, what else might be possible? Could this technology be used to achieve a form of immortality? Could it be applied to other subjects, refined and perfected? These questions would drive Playtime Company's research for the next several decades, leading the company down a path from which there would be no return. Throughout the 1950s and into the 1960s, Playtime Company continued to thrive publicly while conducting increasingly secretive research privately. The company released a steady stream of successful toy lines, each one more innovative than the last. Children across America played with Playtime Company toys, completely unaware of the dark experiments being conducted beneath the cheerful facade of the company's public image. During this period, Ludwig began to construct what would become one of the most significant and sinister aspects of Playtime Company's operations, an underground laboratory beneath the main factory. This facility was built in absolute secrecy, known only to Ludwig and a select few trusted associates. The underground lab would serve as the primary location for the company's most controversial experiments, hidden away from prying eyes and government oversight. The construction of the underground facility required significant resources and careful planning. Ludwig used his considerable wealth and influence to ensure that the project remained secret. Construction workers were compartmentalized, with no single crew understanding the full scope of what they were building. The facility was designed to be completely self-contained, with its own power supply, ventilation systems and security measures. As the 1960s progressed, Elliot Ludwig suffered another profound loss. The exact details remain unclear, but records indicate that someone close to Ludwig died during this decade, compounding the grief he had never fully processed from losing his daughter. This additional tragedy seemed to push Ludwig further into his obsession with conquering death through scientific means. His work became even more consuming, his experiments more ambitious and ethically questionable. It was during the 1960s that Ludwig and his team made a discovery that would prove crucial to their future experiments. They identified a substance derived from poppy flowers that possessed extraordinary properties. This substance, which they named Poppy Gel, seemed to have life-altering capabilities when applied to organic tissue. Initial experiments suggested that Poppy Gel could preserve consciousness, facilitate the transfer of awareness between vessels, and even potentially revive deceased organisms. The discovery of Poppy Gel's properties led to a series of experiments designed to understand and harness its potential. Early tests were conducted on small animals, with researchers attempting to determine the optimal methods for using the gel to preserve and transfer consciousness. These experiments met with mixed results. Some subjects showed promising signs of consciousness preservation, while others failed completely, resulting in nothing more than lifeless tissue. One particularly notable early experiment was designated Experiment 814. This test involved a rat that had been killed and then submerged in poppy gel in an attempt to revive it. The researchers theorized that if the gel could preserve consciousness in living subjects, it might also be able to restore consciousness to recently deceased ones. The experiment failed. The rat remained unresponsive, showing no signs of life or awareness despite prolonged exposure to the gel. Despite setbacks like Experiment 814, the research continued. Ludwig and his team refined their techniques, adjusted their formulas, and gradually developed a better understanding of how poppy gel interacted with organic tissue. They discovered that the gel worked best when combined with other technologies and processes, and that timing was crucial. The longer a subject had been deceased, the less likely the gel was to produce any meaningful results. As Playtime Company entered the 1970s, the company's public success continued to grow even as its private experiments became increasingly controversial. The toy lines released during this decade were some of the company's most popular, generating enormous profits that Ludwig funneled back into research and development. The company's workforce expanded significantly, with hundreds of employees working in various capacities throughout the massive factory complex. It was during the 1970s that Playtime Company began to develop some of its most iconic toy characters. These weren't just simple playthings, but carefully designed mascots with distinct personalities and backstories. The company invested heavily in marketing these characters, creating cartoons, comic books and promotional materials that brought them to life in children's imaginations. What the public didn't know was that these characters were being designed with a dual purpose. They would serve as both commercial products and potential vessels for future experiments. In 1984, Playtime Company introduced one of its most successful toy lines, Huggy Wuggy. The character was designed to be the ultimate huggable companion, a large, blue, furry creature with a wide smile and long arms perfect for embracing. The toy was an immediate hit with children, and Huggy Wuggy quickly became one of the company's most recognizable mascots. The character's success was so significant that Huggy Wuggy effectively became the face of Playtime Company, appearing in advertisements, promotional materials, and eventually serving as a greeter in the factory's main lobby. The success of Huggy Wuggy in the marketplace led to discussions within Playtime Company's leadership about taking the character to the next level. If children loved the toy version of Huggy Wuggy, how much more would they love a life-sized version that could move, interact, and truly seem alive? This thinking would eventually lead to one of the company's most ambitious and horrifying projects, but in 1984 it remained just an idea, a possibility waiting for the right technology and circumstances to make it reality. As the 1980s progressed, Playtime Company's experiments with Poppy gel and consciousness transfer became more sophisticated and more disturbing. The company had moved beyond animal testing and was beginning to consider human subjects. This transition raised enormous ethical questions, but Ludwig and his team had become so consumed by their research that moral considerations seemed increasingly irrelevant compared to the potential breakthroughs they were pursuing. The question of where to obtain human subjects for experimentation was solved through a solution that was as practical as it was morally reprehensible. Playtime Company decided to establish an orphanage. By taking in orphan children, the company would have access to a population that was vulnerable, largely invisible to society, and unlikely to be missed if something went wrong. The orphanage would be presented as a charitable endeavour, a way for the successful company to give back to the community by providing homes for children in need. The orphanage, which would eventually be known as Playcare, was constructed in the underground facility beneath the main factory. This location served multiple purposes. It kept the children isolated from the outside world, making it easier to control information about what happened to them. It also provided convenient access to the laboratory facilities where experiments would be conducted. And perhaps most cynically, it ensured that the children would grow up surrounded by Playtime Company's toys and characters, forming emotional attachments that could be exploited later. Playcare was designed to appear, on the surface, like a caring and nurturing environment. The facility included dormitories, classrooms, recreational areas, and all the amenities one would expect in a well-funded orphanage. The children who lived there were provided with food, clothing, education, and healthcare. They were surrounded by colourful decorations, toys, and the cheerful mascots of Playtime Company. To an outside observer, it might have seemed like an ideal situation for orphaned children. But beneath this cheerful exterior, Playcare served a much darker purpose. The children were not simply being cared for, they were being evaluated, tested, and prepared for potential experimentation. Every aspect of their lives was monitored and documented. Their physical health, mental capabilities, emotional responses, and behavioural patterns were all carefully recorded and analysed. The staff at Playcare were not just caretakers but researchers, gathering data that would be used to select subjects for the experiments to come. To facilitate this evaluation process, Playtime Company constructed a facility called the Game Station. This area was presented to the children as a fun recreational space where they could play games and compete for prizes. In reality, the Game Station was an elaborate testing facility designed to assess the children's cognitive abilities, physical capabilities, and psychological resilience. The games were carefully designed to measure specific attributes that the researchers believed would be important for successful experimentation. The Game Station featured 3 primary types of tests, each designed to evaluate different aspects of a child's capabilities. The first test measured brain speed and efficiency, challenging children to solve puzzles and make quick decisions under pressure. The second test assessed reaction time, requiring children to respond rapidly to visual and auditory stimuli. The third test evaluated physical endurance and strength, pushing children to their limits through various physical challenges. Children at Playcare were assigned specific toys as companions, characters from Playtime Company's various product lines that they were encouraged to bond with emotionally. This served multiple purposes. It helped the company gather data on which toy designs were most appealing to children. It created emotional connections that could be exploited in marketing. And most sinisterly, it prepared the children psychologically for the possibility of being transformed into the very toys they had learned to love. The scores that children achieved in the Game Station test determined their fate. Those who performed exceptionally well, demonstrating high intelligence, quick reflexes, and strong physical capabilities, were flagged as prime candidates for experimentation. These children were seen as having the best chance of surviving the transformation process and producing successful results. Those who scored poorly were generally left alone, considered unsuitable for the rigorous demands of the experiments. As the 1980s drew to a close, Playtime Company's leadership made a decision that would fundamentally alter the company's trajectory. They decided to formalize and expand their experimentation program under an official initiative. This program would be called the Bigger Bodies Initiative, and it would represent the culmination of decades of research into consciousness transfer, biological manipulation, and the creation of living toys. The Bigger Bodies Initiative was spearheaded by a scientist named Dr. Harley Sawyer, who had joined Playtime Company and quickly risen to a position of significant influence. Sawyer was brilliant, ambitious, and utterly lacking in ethical constraints. He saw the potential in Ludwig's research and pushed to expand it in ways that even Ludwig might have hesitated to pursue. Sawyer believed that the company could create living versions of its toy characters, beings that combined human consciousness with artificial bodies designed to resemble the company's most popular products. The proposal for the Bigger Bodies Initiative came at a time when Playtime Company was facing some challenges. Profits, while still substantial, had begun to decline slightly. Some experiments had failed spectacularly, resulting in the loss of valuable resources and subjects. There had also been a few close calls where the company's secret activities had nearly been discovered by outsiders. The Bigger Bodies Initiative was presented as a solution to all these problems, a way to create products so revolutionary that they would secure the company's dominance for generations to come. The Bigger Bodies Initiative entailed illegal and unethical experimentation on humans, primarily the orphan children housed at Playcare. The process involved taking a human subject and through a combination of surgical procedures, chemical treatments with poppy gel, and other technologies, transforming them into a living organism modelled after one of Playtime Company's toy characters. The resulting beings would retain the consciousness and memories of the original human, but would exist in a body that was larger, stronger, and fundamentally different from their original form. The first successful experiment under the Bigger Bodies initiative was designated Experiment 1160, though the subject would become known by another name, Boxy Boo. This experiment proved that the concept could work, that human consciousness could be successfully transferred into and sustained within an artificial body. Boxy Boo was a box-shaped figure with springs connecting various parts of his body, designed to resemble a Jack-in-the-Box toy. The experiment retained a personality that was described as joyful and patient, though whether this was a genuine preservation of the original subject's traits or a result of the transformation process remained unclear. The success of Experiment 1160 energized a research team and led to approval for additional experiments. In 1990, the team created Experiment 1170, which would become known as Huggy Wuggy. This experiment was particularly significant because it involved transforming a human subject into a living version of the company's most popular mascot. The process took an orphaned child from Playcare and, through the horrific procedures of the Bigger Bodies initiative, created a massive blue furry creature with long limbs and a mouth full of sharp teeth. The Huggy Wuggy experiment was considered a tremendous success by the standards of the Bigger Bodies initiative. The resulting creature was large, strong, and capable of following complex instructions. It could move with surprising speed and agility despite its size. Most importantly, it retained enough consciousness and intelligence to serve useful functions within the factory. Huggy Wuggy was assigned to work as security, tasked with protecting the facility from intruders, while also serving as a living statue in the main lobby during business hours. The creation of Huggy Wuggy demonstrated that the Bigger Bodies initiative could produce beings that were not just scientifically interesting, but practically useful. This success led to increased funding and support for the program. More experiments were approved, more subjects were selected from the orphan population at Playcare, and the pace of transformation procedures accelerated. The factory's underground laboratory became a nightmarish production line, churning out living toys at an increasing rate. In January 1991, a young woman named Marie Payne, who had grown up as an orphan at Playcare, was selected to become Experiment 1222. Marie had scored exceptionally well in the game station tests, demonstrating high intelligence and strong physical capabilities. She had also shown signs of emotional instability, including a documented nervous breakdown following a nightmare. The researchers believed that her psychological profile, combined with her physical attributes, made her an ideal candidate for transformation. The experiment that transformed Marie Payne was designed to create a living version of a toy called Mommy Longlegs. This character was a spider-like figure with extremely long elastic limbs made from a new type of elastic plastic that Playtime Company had recently developed. The transformation process was brutal, involving extensive surgical modifications to Marie's body, the application of Poppy gel, and the integration of the elastic plastic material into her physical structure. The resulting creature retained Marie Payne's consciousness and memories, but she was fundamentally changed by the transformation. Mommy Longlegs, as she came to be known, possessed incredible flexibility and reached thanks to her elastic limbs. She could stretch her arms and legs to extraordinary lengths, allowing her to navigate spaces that would be impossible for a normal human. But the transformation had also affected her psychologically. The trauma of the procedure, combined with the horror of her new existence, left her emotionally unstable and prone to violent outbursts. Despite her psychological issues, Mommy Longlegs was considered successful enough that Playtime Company decided to transfer her to the game station, where she would oversee the children's activities. The company even created a commercial toy based on her design and brought it to market, where it achieved moderate success. The children at Playcare were told that Mommy Longlegs was there to take care of them, to be the closest thing to a mother figure they would have. But in reality, she was both a caretaker and a warden, monitoring the children and ensuring they remained compliant with the testing protocols. As the Bigger Bodies initiative continued through the early 1990s, Playtime Company developed new toy lines that would serve as templates for future experiments. One of the most significant of these was the Smiling Critters, a collection of colourful animal characters designed to appeal to young children. Each smiling critter had a distinct personality and appearance, from the cheerful orange dog named Dog Day to the purple cat called Catnap. The toys were marketed with an accompanying cartoon show, though the show's unsettling tone ended up creeping out both children and parents, leading to its limited success. Despite the commercial disappointment of the Smiling Critters cartoon, Playtime Company saw potential in the characters for the Bigger Bodies initiative. The company began creating living versions of the Smiling Critters, transforming orphaned children into these colourful mascots. These experiments were conducted throughout the early 1990s, with each smiling critter being assigned specific roles within the Playcare facility. One of the most significant of these transformations involved a boy named Theodore Gramble. Theodore had attempted to escape from Playcare, a desperate bid for freedom that ended in failure and nearly cost him his life. During this escape attempt, Theodore encountered another experiment, one that would change the course of his existence forever. This experiment was designated 1006, though it would become known by a more ominous name, the Prototype. The Prototype was unlike any other experiment conducted under the Bigger Bodies initiative. While most experiments involved transforming humans into specific toy characters, the Prototype was something different, something more advanced and more dangerous. The exact details of the Prototype's creation remain shrouded in mystery, but what is known is that this being possessed intelligence, awareness, and capabilities that far exceeded those of other experiments. The Prototype could think strategically, plan for the future, and manipulate both humans and other experiments to achieve its goals. When Theodore Gramble's escape attempt failed and he lay dying, the Prototype intervened. For reasons that remain unclear, the Prototype saved Theodore's life, an act of mercy that would have profound consequences. Theodore was subsequently transformed into Experiment 1188, the living version of Catnap, one of the Smiling Critters. But the transformation did more than change Theodore's physical form. It also fundamentally altered his psychology and worldview. Theodore, now Catnap, developed an obsessive devotion to the Prototype. He viewed the being that had saved his life as a god, a saviour worthy of worship and absolute obedience. This religious devotion was unlike anything the researchers had observed in other experiments. Catnap didn't just respect or fear the Prototype, he worshipped it with a fervour that bordered on fanaticism. He began to see himself as the Prototype's servant, an enforcer of its will who would punish any who dared to oppose or question the being he viewed as divine. Catnap's transformation gave him unique abilities that made him particularly dangerous. He possessed the capacity to produce a red gas derived from poppy flowers, a substance that could induce hallucinations, drowsiness, and eventually unconsciousness in those who inhaled it. This gas became Catnap's primary weapon, a tool he would use to control other experiments and eliminate threats to the prototype. Initially, Catnap was assigned to work as a caretaker at Playcare, using his gas to help orphan children fall asleep at night. But his role would evolve into something far more sinister as his devotion to the prototype deepened. Another significant smiling critter transformation involved the creation of Dog Day, who was designated as the leader of the group. Dog Day was created from an orphan who had shown exceptional leadership qualities and a strong moral compass. Unlike Catnap, Dog Day retained much of his original personality and values after transformation. He genuinely cared for the children at Playcare and tried to protect them from the worst aspects of their situation. This put him in direct conflict with Catnap, whose loyalty to the prototype superseded any concern for the welfare of others. The relationship between Dog Day and Catnap represented a fundamental divide among the experiments. Some, like Dog Day, retained their humanity and moral sense despite their transformation. They recognized the horror of what had been done to them and sought to minimize harm where possible. Others, like Catnap, had been so traumatized by their transformation, or so influenced by other factors, that they became willing participants in the cruelty, even enthusiastic enforcers of the system that had victimized them. As more experiments were created and the population of living toys within the factory grew, tensions began to rise. The experiments were conscious beings with memories of their human lives, trapped in bodies that were fundamentally alien to them. They were forced to serve the company that had transformed them, performing tasks that range from mundane labour to active participation in the experimentation process on new subjects. Many experiments were kept in isolation or confined to specific areas of the factory, denied freedom, and treated as property rather than people. The prototype, with its superior intelligence and strategic thinking, began to recognize the potential for organizing the experiments into a unified force. While the researchers saw the prototype as their greatest success, a being that demonstrated the full potential of the Bigger Bodies initiative, they failed to understand that they had created something that could think for itself, plan for the future, and harbor resentment for what had been done to it. The prototype began to communicate with other experiments, building relationships and planting the seeds of rebellion. Throughout the early and mid-1990s, Playtime Company continued to operate at full capacity. The factory employed hundreds of workers, from assembly line staff to engineers, designers, security personnel, and administrative employees. Most of these workers had no idea about the true nature of the experiments being conducted in the underground facility. They came to work each day, performed their assigned tasks, and went home, completely unaware that they were working above a nightmare. The company maintained its public image as a beloved toy manufacturer, releasing new products regularly and maintaining strong sales. Children across the country played with Playtime Company toys, watched the company's cartoons, and begged their parents to visit the factory for tours. The factory tours were carefully controlled, showing visitors only the sanitized public-facing areas of the facility, while keeping them far away from the underground laboratories and the areas where the experiments were housed. But by 1995, the situation within the factory had reached a critical point. The prototype had spent years building influence among the other experiments, convincing them that they didn't have to accept their fate as slaves to the company that had created them. the experiments had watched as more children were taken from Playcare, transformed into creatures like themselves, and forced into servitude. They had witnessed the cruelty of the researchers, the callous disregard for their suffering, and the complete absence of any plan to ever grant them freedom or dignity. The prototype developed a plan for a coordinated uprising, a single moment when all the experiments would act simultaneously to overthrow their human masters. This plan required careful coordination and absolute secrecy. The prototype communicated with key experiments throughout the facility, including Huggy Wuggy, Mommy Longlegs, Catnap and others, assigning each of them specific roles in the coming rebellion. The date was set, August 8th, 1995, at precisely 11 a.m. The prototype called this event the Hour of Joy. The name was bitterly ironic. For the experiments, this would indeed be an hour of joy, a moment of liberation and revenge against those who had tortured them. For the humans working in the factory, it would be an hour of unimaginable terror and death. The prototype's plan was not simply to escape or to take control of the facility. It was to eliminate every human in the factory, to ensure that no one who had participated in or benefited from the experiments would survive. On the morning of August 8th, 1995, the factory operated as it always did. Employees arrived for their shifts, children at Playcare attended their classes and activities, and the various departments of Playtime Company went about their business. There was no indication that anything unusual was about to occur. The experiments had hidden their preparations perfectly, and the humans remained completely unaware of the coordinated attack that was about to be unleashed upon them. At exactly 11 a.m., the Hour of Joy began. Throughout the factory, experiments that had been posing as statues, sleeping or performing their assigned tasks suddenly sprang into action. The attack was coordinated, brutal and overwhelming. The humans, caught completely by surprise, had no chance to mount an effective defense or escape. Within minutes, the factory descended into chaos as the experiments carried out their revenge. In the main lobby, Huggy Wuggy abandoned his post as a decorative statue and began attacking employees. His massive size, sharp teeth and surprising speed made him a terrifying predator. Workers who had walked past him countless times, never imagining that the friendly-looking mascot was actually a living creature capable of violence, found themselves face to face with a nightmare. Huggy Wuggy moved through the lobby with brutal efficiency, eliminating anyone he encountered. At the game station, Mommy Longlegs used her elastic limbs to deadly effect. She could reach employees from impossible distances, grabbing them and either crushing them with her strength or dropping them from great heights. The game station, which had been designed to test children's abilities, became a killing ground as Mommy Longlegs hunted down every human in the area. Her psychological instability, which had been a concern for the researchers, now manifested as savage violence against those who had created her. In Playcare, Catnap deployed his red poppy gas throughout the facility. The gas filled the corridors and rooms, causing humans to experience terrifying hallucinations before losing consciousness. But Catnap didn't simply incapacitate his victims, he ensured they would never wake up. His devotion to the prototype meant that he carried out his assigned role with religious fervour, viewing the elimination of the humans as a sacred duty. The children at Playcare, who had known Catnap as a caretaker who helped them sleep, witnessed a very different side of the creature as he systematically eliminated the adult staff. Throughout the factory, other experiments joined in the massacre. Boxy Boo, Miss Delight, Kissy Missy, and numerous other living toys that had been created through the Bigger Bodies initiative all participated in the Hour of Joy. Each experiment had their own reasons for joining the rebellion, their own grievances against the company and the humans who had transformed them. Some acted out of rage and a desire for revenge. Others participated out of loyalty to the prototype. Still others simply saw the uprising as their only chance for freedom. The Hour of Joy was not a prolonged battle, but a swift and overwhelming massacre. The humans in the factory were not prepared for combat, and they had no weapons or defences that could effectively counter the experiments. Within an hour, virtually every human in the factory had been killed. The experiments had achieved their goal of eliminating their oppressors, but the victory came at a terrible cost. The factory was now filled with the bodies of hundreds of dead employees, and the experiments were left to deal with the aftermath of their actions. In the chaos of the Hour of Joy, one human managed to survive through a combination of luck and quick thinking. This individual, whose identity would remain a mystery for years, somehow avoided the experiment's rampage and escaped from the factory. This survivor would later become known as the Player, the protagonist who would return to the factory years later to uncover the truth about what had happened. The exact circumstances of their escape and their connection to Playtime Company would become subjects of intense speculation and investigation. The immediate aftermath of the Hour of Joy left the experiments in control of the factory but facing an uncertain future. They had eliminated the humans who had tortured them, but they were now trapped in a facility that was cut off from the outside world. The factory's closure would be noticed eventually, and questions would be asked about what had happened to all the employees. The experiments needed to decide what to do next, how to survive in their new reality, and whether they could ever find a way to truly be free. The prototype, having orchestrated the rebellion, now faced the challenge of maintaining order among the experiments. Different experiments had different ideas about what should happen next. Some wanted to leave the factory and try to integrate into the outside world, despite their monstrous appearances. Others wanted to remain in the factory, viewing it as their home despite its dark history. Still others simply wanted to be left alone, to find a quiet corner of the facility where they could exist without interference. One of the most significant disagreements emerged between the prototype and Poppy, the original experiment that Elliot Ludwig had created from his daughter's consciousness. Poppy had been trapped in her doll body for decades, aware of the experiments being conducted but unable to prevent them. She had her own ideas about what should be done with the factory and the experiments, ideas that didn't always align with the prototype's vision. This conflict would simmer beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to erupt into open confrontation. Catnap, with his fanatical devotion to the prototype, appointed himself as an enforcer of the prototype's will. He viewed any experiment that questioned or opposed the prototype as a heretic who needed to be punished. This led to conflict with experiments like Dog Day, who believed that the experiment should work together democratically, rather than following the prototype's dictates without question. The tension between these factions would shape life in the factory for years to come. The experiments also had to deal with the practical challenges of survival. The factory had been designed to be operated by humans, with systems and infrastructure that required maintenance and expertise. Food supplies were limited, and while some experiments didn't need to eat in the traditional sense, others retained enough of their human biology to require sustenance. The experiments had to learn to maintain the factory's systems, manage resources, and create some semblance of order in their new reality. One of the most disturbing aspects of life in the Post-Hour of Joy factory was what the prototype did with the bodies of the dead humans. Rather than simply disposing of them, the prototype began collecting body parts and incorporating them into its own form. This grotesque practice served multiple purposes. It allowed the prototype to repair and enhance itself, adding new capabilities and increasing its physical power. It also sent a clear message to the other experiments about the prototype's dominance and its willingness to do whatever was necessary to achieve its goals. The prototype's body became a horrifying amalgamation of mechanical parts, organic tissue, and components scavenged from both humans and other experiments. This constantly evolving form made the prototype even more intimidating and reinforced its position as the most powerful being in the factory. Experiments that might have considered challenging the prototype's authority were deterred by the sight of this ever-growing monstrosity, a living reminder of what the prototype was capable of. As the years passed following the Hour of Joy, the factory became increasingly isolated from the outside world. The building was officially closed, and the property was eventually abandoned by whatever corporate entities had survived Playtime Company's collapse. The experiments remained inside, hidden from human society, living in the shadows of the massive facility that had been both their birthplace and their prison. The factory became a tomb, filled with the memories of the children who'd been transformed and the humans who'd been killed. Different areas of the factory developed their own atmosphere and cultures. The main lobby, where Huggy Wuggy had once stood as a greeter, became a desolate entrance hall, covered in dust and decay. The game station, where Mommy Longlegs had overseen the children's tests, became her domain, a place where she could be alone with her memories and her madness. Playcare, the underground orphanage where so many children had lived before their transformation, became a haunted space filled with the echoes of young voices that would never be heard again. Catnap established his primary territory in Playcare, particularly in an area called the Playhouse. From this base, he enforced the prototype's will, punishing any experiments that he deemed to be heretics or traitors. His methods were brutal and terrifying, involving the use of his red poppy gas to incapacitate victims before subjecting them to various forms of torture. Catnap's reign of terror kept many experiments in line through fear, but it also bred resentment and a desire for liberation from the prototype's control. Dog Day, who had once been the leader of the Smiling Critters, became one of Catnap's primary targets. Dog Day's refusal to worship the prototype and his attempts to organize resistance against Catnap's brutality made him a threat that needed to be neutralized. Catnap captured Dog Day and subjected him to horrific torture, removing his legs and chaining him in a cell within the playhouse. This brutal punishment served as a warning to other experiments about the consequences of opposing the prototype's authority. Despite his torture and imprisonment, Dog Day maintained his moral convictions and his hope that the experiments could eventually find freedom from the prototype's control. He remained alive, sustained by the same properties that had made the experiments possible in the first place, but his existence became one of constant suffering. The once cheerful leader of the Smiling Critters was reduced to a broken figure, chained and helpless, waiting for either death or rescue. Poppy, trapped in her doll body and unable to move freely without assistance, remained in a specific location within the factory. She had been placed in a case at some point, either by the prototype or by other experiments, effectively imprisoning her and preventing her from interfering with the prototype's plans. Poppy's consciousness remained active, and she spent years thinking, planning, and waiting for an opportunity to act. She knew that eventually someone would return to the factory, and when they did, she would need to be ready. The years between 1995 and the present day saw the factory slowly deteriorate. Without human maintenance, systems began to fail, structures began to decay, and the once pristine facility became increasingly dilapidated. The experiments adapted to these changing conditions, finding ways to survive in an environment that was becoming more hostile with each passing year. Some experiments went into the form of hibernation, conserving energy and waiting. Others remained active, patrolling their territories and maintaining their routines even as the world around them crumbled. The outside world, meanwhile, had no clear understanding of what had happened at Playtime Company. The factory's sudden closure and the disappearance of all its employees remained a mystery. Various theories circulated, from corporate malfeasance to industrial accidents, but the truth was far stranger and more horrifying than anyone imagined. The factory became a local legend, a place that people avoided and whispered about, but few dared to investigate. It was approximately 10 years after the Hour of Joy that the survivor who'd escaped the factory received a mysterious VHS tape. The tape appeared to be from Playtime Company, and it contained a message that seemed to be inviting the recipient back to the factory. The exact contents of the tape and the identity of who sent it remained subjects of speculation, but the effect was clear. It drew the survivor back to the place they had fled a decade earlier. The survivor, now referred to as the player, made the decision to return to the factory. Their motivations for doing so are not entirely clear. Perhaps they felt a sense of responsibility for what had happened. Perhaps they were seeking answers about the fate of former colleagues. Perhaps they simply couldn't resist the pull of unfinished business. Whatever their reasons, the players' return to the factory would set in motion a series of events that would finally bring the truth about Playtime Company to light. The players' arrival at the factory marked the beginning of what would become known as the events of Poppy Playtime Chapter 1, A Tight Squeeze. The player entered through the main entrance, finding the lobby exactly as it had been left 10 years earlier, frozen in time but covered in dust and decay. The colourful decorations and cheerful imagery of Playtime Company's mascots now seemed sinister in the abandoned building, a reminder of the innocent facade that had hidden such dark secrets. As the player explored the lobby, they encountered what appeared to be a statue of Huggy Wuggy standing in his traditional position as the factory's greeter. The player, not yet understanding the true nature of the experiments, likely assumed this was simply a large prop or display piece. They had no way of knowing that they were being watched, that the statue was actually a living creature that was tracking their every move and waiting for the right moment to strike. The players' exploration of the factory required them to solve various puzzles and overcome obstacles, using tools and mechanisms that had been left behind when the factory closed. One of the key tools they discovered was the grab pack, a device that had been used by factory workers to manipulate objects from a distance. The grab pack would prove essential for navigating the factory's challenges, allowing the player to reach switches, grab items, and interact with the environment in ways that would otherwise be impossible. As the player ventured deeper into the factory, they began to find evidence of what had happened during the Hour of Joy. VHS tapes scattered throughout the facility contained recordings that hinted at the experiments, the Bigger Bodies Initiative, and the events of August 8, 1995. These tapes provided crucial context, helping the player understand that they were not alone in the factory factory, and that the dangers they faced were far more serious than they had initially realised. The player's presence in the factory did not go unnoticed by the experiments. Huggy Wuggy, who had been waiting patiently in the lobby, eventually revealed his true nature and began pursuing the player through the facility. The chase was terrifying, with Huggy Wuggy using his size, strength and knowledge of the factory's layout to hunt his prey. The player was forced to run, hide and use their wits to stay ahead of the massive creature that was determined to eliminate this intruder. The confrontation between the player and Huggy Wuggy reached its climax in the factory's ventilation system. The player, desperate to escape, managed to lure Huggy Wuggy into a position where they could trigger a mechanism that would cause the creature to fall. Huggy Wuggy plummeted down a massive shaft, disappearing into the darkness below. Whether this fall killed the experiment or merely incapacitated it remained unclear, but the player had survived their first encounter with one of the factory's living nightmares. With Huggy Wuggy defeated, the player continued their exploration and eventually discovered Poppy's case. The doll had been trapped in this container for years, unable to move or act but fully conscious and aware. The player, not understanding the full implications of what they were doing, opened the case and freed Poppy. This decision would prove to be a turning point, as Poppy would become both an ally and a source of complications for the player's journey through the factory. Poppy immediately demonstrated that she was far more than a simple doll. She could speak, think, and move with a level of sophistication that was startling. She explained to the player that she had been waiting for someone to free her, that she had plans for dealing with the situation in the factory, and that she needed the player's help to accomplish her goals. However, Poppy was not entirely forthcoming about what those goals were, or what role the player would be expected to play in achieving them. The events of Chapter 1 concluded with the player having freed Poppy and survived their encounter with Huggy Wuggy, but with many questions still unanswered. Who had sent the VHS tape that brought the player back to the factory? What were Poppy's true intentions? What other experiments were lurking in the depths of the facility? And most importantly, what was the prototype's role in all of this? These questions would drive the player forward, deeper into the factory and closer to the terrible truth. The events of Poppy Playtime Chapter 2. Fly in a web saw. The player venturing into the game station, the area where orphaned children had once been tested to determine their suitability for experimentation. This section of the factory was vast and complex, filled with the remnants of the games and challenges that had been used to evaluate the children. The colourful, playful aesthetic of the game station stood in stark contrast to the dark purpose it had served, creating an unsettling atmosphere of corrupted innocence. Poppy, now free from her case, accompanied the player in spirit if not always in physical presence. She communicated with the player through various means, providing guidance and information about the factory's layout and the dangers that lay ahead. However, Poppy's assistance came with strings attached. She made it clear that she had her own agenda, and that the player's cooperation was not optional. She needed the player to accomplish something that she could not do alone, though she remained vague about the specifics. The game station was the domain of Mommy Longlegs, the experiment that had once been Mary Payne. Mommy Longlegs had spent the years since the Hour of Joy in this area, surrounded by the games and the memories of the children she'd once overseen. Her psychological state had deteriorated significantly during her isolation, and she had developed an obsessive attachment to the game station and the children who were no longer there. She referred to herself as Mommy, and spoke of the children as if they might return at any moment. When Mommy Longlegs discovered the player's presence in the game station, she saw an opportunity to play the games again, to recreate the experiences she had shared with the children. However, her version of the games was twisted and deadly. She forced the player to participate in 3 challenges, each one based on the original test that had been used to evaluate the orphans. The player had to complete these challenges to progress through the game station, all while avoiding Mommy Longlegs' attempts to capture or kill them. The first challenge tested the player's problem-solving abilities and dexterity, requiring them to manipulate objects and navigate obstacles under time pressure. The second challenge focused on reaction time and quick decision-making, forcing the player to respond rapidly to changing conditions. The third challenge evaluated physical endurance and the ability to maintain performance under stress. These challenges were not just obstacles but echoes of the trauma that the orphaned children had experienced, forced to prove their worth through tests that would determine whether they would be transformed into experiments. Throughout the game station, the player found additional evidence about the Bigger Bodies initiative and the fate of the orphans. Documents, recordings, and environmental storytelling revealed the systematic nature of the experimentation program, the selection criteria used to choose subjects, and the callous disregard for the children's welfare. The player learned about Marie Payne's transformation into Mommy Longlegs, including details about her psychological breakdown and the brutal procedures she had endured. As the player completed the challenges, Mommy Longlegs became increasingly agitated and unstable. She oscillated between treating the player as a playmate and viewing them as a threat. Her dialogue revealed the depth of her trauma and loneliness, speaking about how the children had called her Mommy because she was the closest thing to a mother figure they had, but how they had been taken away from her, leaving her alone in the game station. Her words painted a picture of a being that was simultaneously a victim and a monster, someone who had suffered terribly, but who was also capable of inflicting suffering on others. The confrontation between the player and Mommy Longlegs reached its climax when the player managed to lure her into a position where her elastic body became caught in machinery. The grinding gears of the factory's industrial equipment pulled Mommy Longlegs apart, tearing her elastic limbs and body into pieces. Her death was gruesome and violent, a fitting end for a character whose existence had been defined by violence and trauma. As she died, Mommy Longlegs' final words suggested that there were forces in the factory even more dangerous than herself, hinting at the prototype's continued presence and influence. After Mommy Longlegs' death, the player witnessed something disturbing. A mechanical hand, later revealed to belong to the prototype, emerged from the shadows and dragged away Mommy Longlegs' remains. This brief glimpse confirmed that the prototype was still active in the factory and was continuing its practice of collecting body parts from dead experiments. The sight of this mechanical hand was chilling, a reminder that the player was being watched and that the true power in the factory had yet to reveal itself fully. The player's journey through the game station also led to encounters with smaller experiments, miniature versions of the larger creatures that had been created through the Bigger Bodies initiative. These smaller experiments were numerous and aggressive, attacking the player in swarms and forcing them to use their wits and the grab pack to defend themselves. The existence of these smaller experiments raised questions about the full scope of Playtime Company's experimentation program and suggested that there were many more victims than just the large named experiments. Chapter 2 concluded with the player having survived the game station and learned more about the factory's dark history, but also having been manipulated by Poppy in ways they didn't fully understand. Poppy's true intentions remained unclear, and the player was left to wonder whether they could trust this being who claimed to want to help them, but who also seemed to have her own agenda that might not align with the player's survival or escape. The events of Poppy Playtime Chapter 3. Deep sleep took the player even deeper into the factory, specifically into Playcare, the underground orphanage where the children had lived before their transformation. This area was vast and complex, designed to house and care for dozens of children, while also serving as a testing ground for the Bigger Bodies initiative. Playcare included dormitories, classrooms, recreational areas, and various facilities that had been necessary to maintain the illusion that the orphanage was a caring institution. The atmosphere in Playcare was profoundly unsettling. The area was decorated with cheerful imagery of the smiling critters, the toy line that had been marketed to children and that had served as templates for some of the most significant experiments. But the cheerful decorations were now faded and decaying, covered in dust and grime, creating a sense of abandoned innocence. The empty beds in the dormitories, the silent classrooms, and the unused recreational equipment all served as reminders of the children who had once lived here, and who had been subjected to unimaginable horrors. As the player explored Playcare, they were contacted by a voice calling itself Ollie. This voice, which seemed to come from a child, offered to help the player navigate the dangers of Playcare and avoid the experiments that lurked in the area. Ollie provided guidance, warnings, and information about the layout of Playcare and the locations of various threats. The player, desperate for any assistance in the increasingly dangerous environment, accepted Ollie's help, though they had no way of verifying who Ollie really was or whether his intentions were genuine. The primary threat in Playcare was Catnap, the experiment that had once been Theodore Gramble. Catnap had made Playcare his territory, and he patrolled the area constantly, searching for intruders and heretics who opposed the prototype. His red poppy gas filled many areas of Playcare, forcing the player to navigate carefully and avoid prolonged exposure to the hallucinogenic substance. Catnap's presence was a constant threat, and the player had to use stealth, strategy, and quick thinking to avoid direct confrontation with this deadly experiment. Throughout Playcare, the player discovered extensive documentation about the orphanage's operations, the selection process for experiments, and the lives of the children who had lived there. They found incident reports detailing behavioural problems, medical records documenting the children's health, and psychological evaluations assessing their suitability for transformation. These documents painted a picture of a systematic program of abuse, where vulnerable children were evaluated, categorized, and ultimately sacrificed for the sake of scientific advancement and corporate profit. One of the most significant discoveries in Playcare was the Playhouse, a structure that had been designed as a recreational facility for the children, but that had become Catnap's primary base of operations. The Playhouse was filled with evidence of Catnap's devotion to the prototype, including shrines, writings, and other materials that demonstrated the religious fervour with which he worshipped the being that had saved his life. The Playhouse also contained cells where Catnap had imprisoned experiments that he deemed to be heretics or threats to the prototype's authority. In one of these cells, the player discovered Dog Day, the former leader of the Smiling Critters, who had been tortured and imprisoned by Catnap. Dog Day was in terrible condition. his legs removed and his body chained to the wall. Despite his suffering, Dog Day retained his moral convictions and his concern for others. He warned the player about Catnap's fanaticism and the prototype's true nature, explaining that the prototype was not a saviour, but a manipulator who used other experiments to achieve its own goals. Dog Day's warnings came too late to save him. As he spoke with the player, smaller experiments that had been loyal to Catnap emerged and attacked Dog Day, overwhelming him and dragging him away. The player was forced to flee, unable to save Dog Day from his fate. This encounter demonstrated the brutal reality of life in the factory, where even those who tried to resist the prototype control were ultimately destroyed by the system that had created them. The player's exploration of Playcare also revealed information about the Hour of Joy, including VHS tapes that showed footage of the massacre. These tapes were disturbing and graphic, showing the experiments attacking and killing factory employees with brutal efficiency. The footage confirmed that the Hour of Joy had been a coordinated uprising orchestrated by the prototype, and that virtually every experiment in the factory had participated in the violence. The tapes also showed the prototype itself, though only briefly, giving the player their first clear look at the being that controlled the factory. As the player progressed through Playcare, they learned more about Catnap's backstory, including his original identity as Theodore Gramble and his transformation into Experiment 1188. They discovered documentation about Theodore's escape attempt, his rescue by the prototype, and his subsequent transformation into Catnap. The record showed how Theodore's gratitude to the prototype had evolved into religious devotion, and how this devotion had been exploited by the prototype to create a loyal enforcer who would punish any experiment that questioned the established order. The confrontation between the player and Catnap was inevitable, and it finally occurred in a dramatic sequence that tested everything the player had learned about surviving in the factory. Catnap pursued the player through various areas of Playcare, using his gas to disorient and weaken them, while also employing his physical abilities to corner and attack. The player had to use environmental hazards, quick reflexes, and strategic thinking to stay ahead of Catnap and avoid being captured or killed. The final confrontation with Catnap revealed the depth of his devotion to the prototype and the tragedy of his existence. Catnap genuinely believed that he was serving a divine being, that his actions were righteous, and that those who opposed the prototype deserved punishment. His fanaticism was absolute, leaving no room for doubt or compromise. When the player finally managed to defeat Catnap, it was not through superior strength, but through exploiting his devotion, using the prototype's own influence against him. In a shocking turn of events, the prototype itself intervened in the final moments of the confrontation with Catnap. Rather than allowing Catnap to continue serving, the prototype killed its most loyal follower, impaling him with its mechanical appendages. This act demonstrated the prototype's true nature. It was not a benevolent god, but a ruthless manipulator that viewed other experiments as tools to be used and discarded when they were no longer useful. Catnap's death was a betrayal of the devotion he had shown, a final tragedy for a character who'd been victimized, transformed, and ultimately destroyed by the system he had come to worship. After Catnap's death, the prototype once again collected the body parts, dragging Catnap's remains away to be incorporated into its ever-growing form. This practice of collecting and assimilating other experiments had become the prototype's defining characteristic, a grotesque form of evolution that made it stronger and more capable with each edition. The sight of Catnap being dragged away was a stark reminder of the fate that awaited all experiments in the factory. They would either serve the prototype's purposes or become part of its body. The revelation about Ollie came as a shocking twist. The voice that had been helping the player throughout their journey through Playcare was not actually a child, but the prototype itself, using a disguised voice to manipulate the player into doing its bidding. The prototype had guided the player through Playcare, helped them avoid certain dangers, and ultimately used them to eliminate Catnap, who had perhaps become too fanatical and unpredictable to be useful anymore. This manipulation demonstrated the prototype's intelligence and strategic thinking, showing that it was always several steps ahead of everyone else in the factory. Chapter 3 concluded with the player having survived Playcare and learned the truth about the prototype's manipulative nature, but also having been used as a pawn in the prototype's larger plans. The player's relationship with Poppy became more complex as well, with Poppy revealing more about her own history and her opposition to the prototype. Poppy explained that she and the prototype had fundamentally different visions for what should happen with the factory and the experiments, and that the player would need to choose which side they would support. The ongoing story of Poppy Playtime continues to unfold with subsequent chapters, each one revealing more about the factory's history, the experiment's fates, and the ultimate confrontation between Poppy and the prototype. The player remains caught in the middle of this conflict, trying to survive while also uncovering the truth about their own connection to Playtime Company, and the role they played in the events that led to the Hour of Joy. The mystery of the player's identity has become one of the most significant questions in the Poppy Playtime narrative. Various theories have emerged about who the player might be and why they returned to the factory. Some theories suggest that the player was a high-ranking employee at Playtime Company, possibly someone involved in the Bigger Bodies initiative, or someone who had knowledge of the experiments but chose to remain silent. Other theories propose that the player might have been a researcher, an engineer, or even someone connected to Elliot Ludwig himself. One particularly compelling theory suggests that the player might have been involved in the decision-making that led to the creation of the Bigger Bodies initiative, or the establishment of Playcare. If this is true, then the player's return to the factory might be motivated by guilt, a desire to atone for their role in the suffering of the orphaned children. This would explain why the player seems to have some familiarity with the factory's layout and systems, and why they possess the skills necessary to navigate the dangerous environment. Another theory proposes that the player might have been one of the few employees who opposed the experiments and tried to stop them, only to be forced to flee during the Hour of Joy. In this interpretation, the player's return would be motivated by a desire to finish what they started, to finally shut down the factory and free the experiments from their torment. This theory would cast the player as a more heroic figure, someone who has always been on the side of the victims rather than the perpetrators. The relationship between the player and Poppy has become increasingly important as the story progresses. Poppy clearly has her own agenda, and while she claims to want to help the player escape the factory, her actions suggest that she needs the player for something more significant. Poppy has demonstrated that she is willing to manipulate the player, withholding information and guiding them towards specific goals without fully explaining why. This has led to speculation about what Poppy's ultimate plan might be, and whether the player can truly trust her. Poppy's history as Elliot Ludwig's daughter, transformed into a doll through the extract process, gives her a unique perspective on the factory and the experiments. She's existed for decades, watching as the Bigger Bodies initiative created more and more experiments, witnessing the hour of joy and observing the aftermath. She's had years to think, plan, and develop her own vision for what should happen next. Her opposition to the prototype suggests that she believes there is a better way forward, but the specifics of her plan remain unclear. The prototype remains the most enigmatic and threatening presence in the factory. Its origins, its true motivations, and its ultimate goals are still subjects of speculation and investigation. What is clear is that the prototype possesses intelligence that far exceeds that of other experiments, strategic thinking that allows it to manipulate both humans and experiments, and a ruthless willingness to do whatever is necessary to achieve its objectives. The prototype's practice of collecting and incorporating body parts from other experiments has made it a constantly evolving entity, one that grows stronger and more capable with each addition to its form. Some theories about the prototype suggest that it might have been the first experiment created under the Bigger Bodies initiative, a prototype that demonstrated the potential of the technology, but that also revealed the dangers of creating beings with too much intelligence and autonomy. Other theories propose that the prototype might have been created from someone with a specific connection to Elliot Ludwig, a Playtime company, someone whose consciousness and personality made them particularly suited to becoming the dominant force in the factory. One particularly intriguing theory suggests that the prototype might have been created from a child who had a close relationship with Elliot Ludwig, possibly even a child named Oliver who had some connection to Ludwig's family. This theory is supported by the fact that the prototype used the name Ollie when disguising its voice to manipulate the player, suggesting that this name has some significance to the prototype's identity. If the prototype was indeed created from someone close to Ludwig, it would add another layer of tragedy to the story, showing how Ludwig's attempts to preserve consciousness and conquer death ultimately created the very force that would destroy his company and kill his employees. The experiments that remain in the factory represent a diverse population with different perspectives, motivations, and levels of loyalty to the prototype. Some experiments, like Catnap, were fanatically devoted to the prototype and willing to do anything to serve its will. Others, like Dog Day, opposed the prototype and tried to resist its control, even at great personal cost. Still others simply tried to survive, avoiding conflict and finding ways to exist in the dangerous environment of the post-hour of joy factory. The smaller experiments, the miniature versions of the larger creatures, represent another aspect of the factory's population. These beings are numerous, aggressive, and seem to operate more on instinct than conscious thought. They attack intruders on sight and show little evidence of the complex consciousness that characterizes the larger experiments. This raises questions about the Bigger Bodies initiative's success rate, and suggests that not all transformations resulted in beings with preserved human consciousness. Some subjects might have been reduced to little more than aggressive animals, retaining only the most basic drives and instincts. The factory itself has become a character in the story, a massive structure filled with secrets, dangers, and the echoes of past tragedies. Different areas of the factory have different atmospheres and purposes, from the cheerful but decaying lobby to the nightmarish game station to the haunted corridors of Playcare. The factory's size and complexity make it a labyrinth that is difficult to navigate, with many areas still unexplored and many secrets still waiting to be discovered. The technology that made the Bigger Bodies initiative possible represents a significant scientific achievement, albeit one that was used for horrific purposes. The ability to transfer human consciousness into artificial bodies, to preserve awareness beyond death, and to create beings that combine organic and mechanical components is revolutionary. In different hands, with different ethical guidelines, this technology might have been used to help people, to extend life, or to create new forms of existence that could benefit humanity. Instead, it was used to exploit vulnerable children and create monsters. The Poppy gel that made much of this technology possible remains a mysterious substance, with properties that are not fully understood. The gel's ability to preserve consciousness, facilitate transformation, and sustain life in artificial bodies suggests that it has properties that go beyond conventional science. Some theories suggest that the poppy flowers from which the gel is derived might have supernatural or otherworldly properties, that there is something fundamentally unusual about the substance that cannot be explained through normal scientific principles. The ethical implications of the Bigger Bodies initiative are staggering. The program involved kidnapping orphaned children, subjecting them to brutal experimentation, transforming them into creatures that were no longer human, and then forcing them to serve the company that had victimized them. The researchers and executives who approved and conducted these experiments demonstrated a complete absence of moral consideration, viewing the children as nothing more than raw materials for their scientific ambitions. The fact that this program was conducted in secret, hidden beneath a legitimate toy company, makes it even more disturbing. The Hour of Joy, while horrific in its violence, can be understood as a response to years of abuse and exploitation. The experiments had been victimized, transformed against their will, and forced into servitude. They had watched as more children were taken from Playcare and subjected to the same fate. They had been treated as property rather than people, denied freedom and dignity. In this context, their uprising can be seen as an act of desperation and self-defense, a violent rejection of the system that had oppressed them. This does not excuse the violence or the deaths of innocent employees who may have had no knowledge of the experiments, but it provides context for understanding why the experiments acted as they did. The aftermath of the Hour of Joy has created a situation where the experiments are trapped in a different kind of prison. They are no longer slaves to human masters, but they are still confined to the factory, still living in the shadows, and still subject to the prototype's control. The freedom they gain through violence has proven to be limited and hollow. They have traded one form of oppression for another, and many experiments have come to realize that true freedom will require more than just eliminating their human oppressors. The role of Elliot Ludwig in all of this remains complex and tragic. Ludwig founded Playtime Company with the genuine intention of bringing joy to children. His early work in toy design was innovative and successful, creating products that delighted children and built a thriving company. But his personal tragedies, particularly the loss of his daughter Poppy, led him down a path that ultimately betrayed his original values. His obsession with conquering death and preserving consciousness resulted in the creation of technologies and programs that caused immense suffering. It is unclear how much Ludwig knew about the full extent of the Bigger Bodies initiative and the abuse of the orphaned children. Some evidence suggests that he was directly involved in the experiments, particularly the creation of the first Poppy doll. Other evidence suggests that he may have become increasingly disconnected from the day-to-day operations of the company, allowing people like Dr. Harley Sawyer to pursue their own agendas without adequate oversight. Ludwig's death, which occurred at some point before the hour of joy, meant that he never had to face the full consequences of what his company had become. The question of what should happen to the experiments is one of the most difficult ethical dilemmas in the Poppy Playtime narrative. These beings are victims who have suffered terribly, but they are also capable of violence and have killed many people. They are conscious, aware beings who deserve consideration and compassion, but they are also dangerous and cannot simply be released into society. Some experiments, like Dog Day, retain their moral sense and try to minimize harm. Others, like Catnap, became perpetrators of cruelty themselves. The diversity of the experiment's responses to their situation makes it impossible to treat them as a monolithic group. Poppy's plan, whatever it might be, presumably involves finding some resolution to this dilemma. She has suggested that she wants revenge on those who tortured the experiments, but most of the humans responsible are already dead, killed during the hour of joy. Her opposition to the prototype suggests that she believes the experiments need to be freed from its control, but it is unclear what she envisions happening after that. Does she want to destroy all the experiments, ending their suffering permanently? Does she want to find a way for them to live peacefully, perhaps in isolation from human society? Or does she have some other plan that has not yet been revealed? The player's role in all of this continues to evolve. Initially, they may have returned to the factory simply seeking answers or closure, but as they have learned more about the experiments, the bigger body's initiative, and the events of the hour of joy, they have become increasingly entangled in the conflict between Poppy and the prototype. The player's choices and actions will likely determine the ultimate fate of the factory and everyone in it. Whether they choose to support Poppy's plan, oppose it, or try to find a third option will shape the conclusion of the story. The broader implications of the Poppy Playtime story extend beyond the specific events at the factory. The narrative raises questions about corporate responsibility, the ethics of scientific experimentation, the treatment of vulnerable populations, and the consequences of pursuing knowledge without moral constraints. Playtime Company represents a cautionary tale about what can happen when profit and ambition are prioritized over human welfare, when secrecy allows abuse to flourish unchecked, and when those in power view others as means to an end rather than as people deserving of dignity and respect. The story also explores themes of identity and consciousness. What does it mean to be human? If a person's consciousness is transferred into an artificial body, are they still the same person? The experiments in the factory retain memories and personality traits from their human lives, but they have been fundamentally changed by their transformation. They exist in bodies that are alien to them, with capabilities and limitations that are very different from what they experienced as humans. Some experiments seem to have adapted to their new existence, while others are clearly traumatized and struggling with their identity. The concept of consciousness preservation and transfer raises philosophical questions that humanity has grappled with for centuries. If consciousness can be separated from the body and transferred to a new vessel, what does that say about the nature of the soul? Is consciousness simply a pattern of information that can be copied and moved? Or is there something more fundamental about human existence that cannot be replicated through technology? The experiments in Poppy Playtime exist in a liminal space between life and death, human and artificial, raising questions about what it means to truly be alive. The relationship between memory and identity is another important theme. The The experiments retain memories from their human lives, but those memories exist in tension with their current reality. They remember being children, having families, experiencing normal human emotions and sensations, but they now exist in bodies that are incapable of many human experiences. They cannot grow, age, or change in the ways that humans do. They're trapped in forms that were designed for specific purposes, unable to escape or transform themselves further. This disconnect between memory and reality creates a form of psychological torture that may be worse than physical pain. The factory's various areas each tell their own stories about different aspects of the Bigger Bodies initiative and its impact. The lobby, with its cheerful decorations and Huggy Wuggy statue, represents the public face of Playtime Company, the innocent facade that hid the dark reality beneath. The game station represents the systematic evaluation and selection of victims, the cold calculation that determined which children would be transformed. Playcare represents the long-term exploitation of vulnerable children, the creation of a captive population that could be used for experimentation. Each area is a monument to a different aspect of the company's crimes. The VHS tapes scattered throughout the factory serve as a form of documentation, preserving evidence of what happened and providing context for the player's discoveries. These tapes include training videos for employees, recordings of experiments, documentation of the Hour of Joy, and various other materials that help piece together the timeline of events. The tapes are often disturbing, showing the casual cruelty of the researchers and the suffering of the experiments. They serve as a reminder that the horrors of the factory were not accidents or mistakes, but deliberate choices made by people who knew exactly what they were doing. The smaller details throughout the factory add depth to the story, and provide additional context for understanding the full scope of what happened. Incident reports document behavioural problems among the orphans, showing how the stress of their situation affected them psychologically. Medical records reveal the physical toll of the transformation process and the various complications that arose. Personal items left behind by employees and children serve as reminders that these were real people with lives, hopes, and dreams that were destroyed by the Bigger Bodies initiative. The design of the experiments themselves reflects the twisted logic of the Bigger Bodies initiative. Each experiment was designed to resemble a specific toy character, but the transformation process resulted in beings that were far more disturbing than their toy counterparts. Huggy Wuggy, designed to be a huggable companion, became a massive predator with sharp teeth and crushing strength. Mommy Longlegs, designed to be a playful spider character, became a creature with grotesquely elongated limbs and unstable psychology. Catnap, designed to help children sleep, became a weapon that could incapacitate and kill with his gas. The experiments are perversions of childhood innocence, taking things that should bring joy and transforming them into sources of terror. The smiling critters, as a group, represent a particularly tragic aspect of the story. These characters were designed to be friendly, approachable mascots that would appeal to young children. The cartoon show featuring the smiling critters was meant to be wholesome entertainment, but the living versions of these characters became prisoners, weapons, and victims. Dog Day, who should have been a symbol of loyalty and friendship, was tortured and imprisoned. Catnap, who should have been a comforting presence, became a fanatical enforcer of the prototype's will. The other smiling critters met similar fates, their original purposes corrupted by the circumstances of their creation. The technology used to create the experiments represents a significant achievement in multiple fields, including biotechnology, consciousness studies, materials science and engineering. The ability to create living organisms that combine organic and mechanical components, that can sustain consciousness in artificial bodies, and that possess capabilities beyond normal human limitations is remarkable. The elastic plastic used in Mommy Long Legs, the gas-producing capabilities of Catnap, and the various other specialized features of different experiments all demonstrate sophisticated understanding of biology and chemistry. However, this technological achievement was built on a foundation of suffering and exploitation. The knowledge gained through the Bigger Bodies initiative came at the cost of countless children's lives and well-being. This raises questions about whether knowledge gained through unethical means can ever be justified, whether the ends can justify the means, and what responsibility scientists and researchers have to consider the ethical implications of their work. The researchers at Playtime Company clearly believed that their scientific goals justified the suffering they caused, but the story presents this belief as fundamentally wrong. The role of Dr. Harley Sawyer in the Bigger Bodies initiative marks him as one of the story's primary villains. Sawyer was the driving force behind the expansion of the experimentation program, the one who pushed for more aggressive and extensive experiments. His brilliance as a scientist was matched only by his complete lack of ethical constraints. Sawyer saw the orphaned children not as people, but as resources to be exploited, subjects to be experimented on without regard for their suffering or their rights. His influence on Playtime Company was profound and destructive, transforming the company from a toy manufacturer into a nightmare factory. The fate of Dr. Sawyer himself remains unclear. He may have been killed during the Hour of Joy along with most other employees, or he may have escaped somehow. Some theories suggest that Sawyer might have been transformed into one of the experiments, either voluntarily or as punishment by other researchers. The possibility that Sawyer might still exist in some form, either as a human or as an experiment, adds another layer of uncertainty to the story and raises questions about whether he will face justice for his crimes. The other employees of Playtime Company represent a spectrum of complicity and innocence. Some employees, particularly those working in the underground laboratory, were directly involved in the experiments and fully aware of what was happening. These individuals made conscious choices to participate in the abuse of children, and their deaths during the Hour of Joy can be seen as a form of justice, however brutal. Other employees, particularly those working in the public-facing areas of the factory, may have had no knowledge of the experiments and were simply doing their jobs. Their deaths during the Hour of Joy were tragic and unjust, representing the collateral damage of the experiment's uprising. The question of how so many employees could work at the factory without discovering the truth about the experiments speaks to the effectiveness of compartmentalization and secrecy. Playtime Company carefully controlled information, ensuring that employees only knew what was necessary for their specific roles. The underground facility was hidden and secured, accessible only to those with proper clearance. The orphanage was presented as a charitable endeavour, and most employees probably believed that the children were being cared for rather than exploited. This compartmentalization allowed the Bigger Bodies initiative to operate for years without being exposed. The children who lived at Playcare before their transformation represent the most innocent victims of the entire story. These were orphans who had already suffered the loss of their families and who were vulnerable and dependent on adults for care and protection. Instead of receiving the love and support they needed, they were subjected to evaluation, testing, and ultimately transformation into experiments. The psychological trauma of this experience, combined with the physical horror of the transformation process, created beings that were fundamentally damaged and suffering. The selection process for experiments was coldly calculated and systematic. Children were evaluated based on their performance in the game station tests, with those showing the highest capabilities being selected for transformation. This created a perverse incentive structure, where success in the tests led not to rewards, but to victimization. The children who tried their hardest, who demonstrated intelligence and physical ability, were the ones most likely to be selected for the bigger body's initiative. This inverted the normal relationship between achievement and reward, turning success into a death sentence. The psychological impact of the transformation process on the experiments cannot be overstated. Imagine being a child, already traumatized by the loss of your family and the stress of living in an orphanage, and then being subjected to procedures that transform you into a creature that is no longer human. The physical pain of the transformation would be immense, but the psychological trauma would be even worse. The experiments had to come to terms with the loss of their human bodies, the alienation from their former identities, and the reality that they would never be able to return to normal human life. Different experiments responded to this trauma in different ways. Some, like Dog Day, tried to maintain their humanity and moral values despite their transformation. They recognized that they were victims and tried to minimize the harm they caused to others. Others, like Catnap, developed coping mechanisms that involved embracing their new identity and finding meaning through devotion to the prototype. Still others simply broke under the strain, their personalities fragmenting or their sanity deteriorating as they struggled to process what had been done to them. The concept of the prototype as a god figure for some experiments represents a form of religious response to trauma. Catnap's worship of the prototype can be understood as an attempt to find meaning and purpose in a situation that was otherwise meaningless and horrific. By viewing the prototype as a divine being and himself as a servant of that being, Catnap created a framework that gave his existence structure and purpose. This religious devotion, while ultimately destructive, served a psychological function by providing Catnap with a sense of identity and mission that helped him cope with the horror of his transformation. The prototype's willingness to accept and exploit this worship demonstrates its manipulative nature. The prototype understood that Catnap's devotion made him a useful tool, someone who could be relied upon to enforce the prototype's will without question. The prototype encouraged this devotion, allowing Catnap to build shrines and develop his religious practices because it served the prototype's purposes. But when Catnap was no longer useful, the prototype had no hesitation in killing him, demonstrating that the god Catnap worshipped was actually a cold, calculating entity that viewed him as nothing more than a disposable asset. The relationship between the experiments and the children who were not yet transformed is another tragic aspect of the story. Experiments like Mommy Longlegs and the Smiling Critters were assigned to care for and oversee the children at Playcare and the game station. This created a situation where the children were being cared for by beings who had once been children themselves, who'd been through the same evaluation process, and who knew exactly what fate awaited those who scored too well on the tests. The experiments had to watch as more children were selected for transformation, knowing that they were powerless to prevent it, and that any attempt to interfere would likely result in punishment. Some experiments, particularly those who retained their moral sense, found this situation unbearable. They formed emotional attachments to the children they were supposed to oversee, viewing them as younger siblings, or even as their own children in some cases. Mommy Longleg's insistence that the children called her Mommy reflects this dynamic. She wanted to be a mother figure to them, to provide the care and protection that she herself had never received. But she was also complicit in the system that would ultimately victimize those same children, creating a profound moral conflict that contributed to her psychological instability. The experiment's awareness of their own victimization and their simultaneous participation in the victimization of others creates a complex moral situation. They are both victims and perpetrators, both sympathetic and culpable. This moral ambiguity is one of the most sophisticated aspects of the Poppy Playtime narrative, refusing to present the experiments as simply good or evil, but instead showing them as complex beings shaped by trauma and circumstance. This complexity makes the story more realistic and more emotionally resonant, forcing the audience to grapple with difficult questions about responsibility, justice, and redemption. The physical design of the factory itself reflects the dual nature of Playtime Company as both a legitimate business and a site of horrific experimentation. The public-facing areas of the factory are colourful, cheerful, and designed to appeal to children and families. These areas showcase the company's toy products, feature friendly mascots, and create an atmosphere of fun and innocence. But beneath this cheerful exterior lies the underground facility, a stark and clinical space designed for experimentation and control. This architectural division mirrors the company's split identity, presenting one face to the world while hiding its true nature underground. The decay and deterioration of the factory in the years since the Hour of Joy adds another layer to the atmosphere. The once pristine facility has become a ruin, with systems failing, structures crumbling, and nature beginning to reclaim the space. This physical decay mirrors the moral decay that led to the factory's downfall, creating a visual representation of how corruption and evil ultimately lead to destruction. The contrast between the factory's former glory and its current state serves as a reminder of how far Playtime Company fell from its original mission of bringing joy to children. The use of colour in the factory's design is particularly significant. The bright primary colours associated with children's toys and entertainment are present throughout the facility, but they take on a sinister quality in the context of the experiments and the abuse that occurred. Colours that should evoke happiness and innocence instead create a sense of unease and wrongness. The cheerful yellows, reds and blues of the smiling critters become disturbing when associated with the living experiments that bear those colours. This corruption of childhood imagery is a central element of the horror in Poppy Playtime. The sound design of the factory also contributes to the atmosphere. The echoing footsteps in empty corridors, the creaking of old machinery, the distant sounds of experiments moving through the facility, and the unsettling music that plays in various areas all create a sense of dread and anticipation. The factory is never truly silent. There is always some sound suggesting that the player is not alone, that something is watching or approaching. This auditory environment keeps tension high and reinforces the sense that the factory is a living, threatening space. The puzzles that the player must solve to progress through the factory serve multiple purposes in the narrative. On a practical level, they provide gameplay challenges that test the player's problem-solving abilities and understanding of the factory's systems. On a narrative level, They demonstrate that the player has knowledge and skills that suggest familiarity with the factory's operations. The ability to operate the grab pack, understand the factory's power systems, and navigate its security measures all suggest that the player is not just a random visitor, but someone with a specific connection to Playtime Company. The grab pack itself is an interesting piece of technology that reveals something about the factory's operations. This device was apparently standard equipment for factory workers, allowing them to manipulate objects from a distance and interact with systems that would otherwise be inaccessible. The existence of such a tool suggests that the factory's design required workers to frequently reach distance switches, grab objects from dangerous locations, and perform tasks that would be difficult or impossible with bare hands. This raises questions about why the factory was designed this way, and whether the need for such tools was related to the experiments and the need to maintain distance from dangerous areas. The various collectibles scattered throughout the factory provide additional context and backstory. Documents, recordings, and personal items left behind by employees and children all contribute to the larger narrative, filling in details about specific individuals and events. These collectibles reward exploration and provide incentive for players to thoroughly investigate every area of the factory. They also serve to humanize the victims of the Bigger Bodies initiative, reminding the audience that these were real people with lives and stories, not just abstract victims. The pacing of the revelations about the factory's history is carefully controlled to maintain mystery and build tension. The player, and by extension the audience, learns about the experiments, the Bigger Bodies initiative, and the Hour of Joy gradually, with each new discovery adding to the understanding of what happened. This gradual revelation allows for moments of shock and horror, as particularly disturbing details are uncovered, while also maintaining enough mystery to keep the audience engaged and wanting to learn more. The use of VHS tapes as a storytelling device is particularly effective, evoking a sense of nostalgia while also creating a feeling of authenticity. The grainy, low-quality video footage feels like genuine documentation from the 1990s, adding to the sense that these events really happened within the game's universe. The tapes also allow for the presentation of information that the player could not otherwise access, showing events that occurred before their arrival or in areas they cannot reach. This expands the scope of the narrative beyond the player's direct experience. The horror in Poppy Playtime operates on multiple levels. There is the immediate visceral horror of being chased by monsters and facing physical danger. There is the psychological horror of uncovering the truth about the experiments and the abuse of children. There is the existential horror of contemplating what it would be like to have your consciousness trapped in an artificial body. And there is the moral horror of recognizing that these atrocities were committed by humans against children, that this was not the work of supernatural evil, but of human cruelty and ambition. The game's approach to horror is sophisticated, using jump scares sparingly, and instead building tension through atmosphere, sound design, and the gradual revelation of disturbing information. The most effective horror moments are often not when an experiment attacks, but when the player discovers a new piece of evidence about what happened to the children, when they realize the full scope of the Bigger Bodies initiative, or when they understand the implications of what they are seeing. This approach creates a horror experience that is both immediate and lingering, affecting players long after they have stopped playing. The experiments themselves are designed to be both frightening and pitiable. They are dangerous and capable of killing the player, creating genuine threat and tension. but they are also victims who have suffered terribly, beings who deserve sympathy and compassion despite their monstrous appearances and violent actions. This duality makes encounters with the experiments emotionally complex, creating a sense of tragedy alongside the fear. The player must defend themselves against the experiments, but doing so means harming beings who've already been victimized enough. The question of whether the experiments can be redeemed or saved is central to the narrative. Some experiments, like Catnap, seem to have been so corrupted by their experiences that redemption may not be possible. Others, like Dog Day, retained their moral sense and tried to do good despite their circumstances, suggesting that redemption is possible for those who choose it. The diversity of the experiment's responses to their situation suggests that they should be judged as individuals rather than as a group, that each experiment's actions and choices matter in determining their moral status. Poppy's role as a potential redeemer or judge of the experiments adds another layer to this question. As the first experiment, the one who has existed the longest and observed the most, Poppy has a unique perspective on what the experiments have become and what they might deserve. Her opposition to the prototype suggests that she believes the experiment should not be under its control, but her ultimate plan for them remains unclear. Does she want to free them, destroy them, or something else entirely? The answer to this question will likely be central to the story's conclusion. The player's moral position in all of this is also complex. If the player was indeed involved in the Bigger Bodies initiative, or knew about the experiments and did nothing, then they bear some responsibility for what happened. Their return to the factory could be seen as an attempt at atonement, a way of finally taking action to address the wrongs they witnessed or participated in. However, if the player was innocent or opposed the experiments, then their current situation is deeply unfair, forcing them to risk their life to clean up a mess they didn't create. The relationship between Poppy and the prototype represents a fundamental conflict about power, control, and the future of the experiments. The prototype seems to believe in a hierarchical system where it rules over the other experiments, using them as tools to achieve its goals, and eliminating them when they're no longer useful. Poppy seems to believe in something different, though the specifics of her vision remain unclear. This conflict will likely drive the climax of the story, with the player caught in the middle and forced to choose which vision they will support. The factory's isolation from the outside world raises questions about what will happen when the truth about Playtime Company is finally revealed. The experiments cannot remain hidden forever, and eventually, someone other than the player will discover what happened. How will society respond to the revelation that a toy company was conducting horrific experiments on children? What will happen to the experiments themselves when they are discovered? Will they be seen as victims deserving of compassion, or as monsters that need to be destroyed? These questions have no easy answers and will likely be addressed as the story continues. The legal and ethical questions surrounding the experiments are profound. These beings were created through illegal experimentation on children, making their very existence a crime. But they are also conscious, aware beings who did not choose to be created and to have their own rights and interests. How should society balance the need for justice for the crimes committed against the children with the rights of the experiments who resulted from those crimes? Should the experiments be held responsible for the deaths they caused during the hour of joy, or should they be seen as acting in self-defense against their oppressors? The scientific community's potential response to the discovery of the Bigger Bodies Initiative is another interesting consideration. The technology that made the experiments possible represents a significant breakthrough in multiple fields, and there would undoubtedly be scientists who would want to study and potentially replicate the results. However, the unethical nature of how the technology was developed would make it extremely controversial. Would the scientific community reject the knowledge gained through such horrific means, or would some argue that the knowledge should be preserved and used despite its origins? The experiment's potential integration into society, if such a thing were even possible, would face enormous challenges. Their appearances alone would make them objects of fear and curiosity. Their histories as victims of experimentation and participants in the hour of joy would make them controversial figures. Their unique needs and capabilities would require special accommodations that society might not be willing or able to provide. The experiments might find that even if they escape the factory, they'll never truly be free or accepted. The theme of childhood innocence corrupted runs throughout the Poppy Playtime narrative. The factory was supposed to be a place that created joy for children, but it became a place where children were victimized and destroyed. The toys that were supposed to bring happiness became templates for monsters. The orphanage that was supposed to provide care became a hunting ground for experimental subjects. The games that were supposed to be fun became tests that determined who would be transformed. Every aspect of childhood that should have been protected and nurtured was instead exploited and corrupted. This corruption of childhood innocence is particularly disturbing because it represents a betrayal of trust. Children are supposed to be able to trust adults to protect them, to trust that institutions like orphanages will care for them, to trust that toys and games are safe and fun. The Bigger Bodies Initiative violated all of these trusts, using the vulnerability of children against them, and transforming spaces and objects that should have been safe into sources of danger and trauma. This betrayal is at the heart of the horror in Poppy Playtime. The role of capitalism and profit motive in the story cannot be ignored. Playtime Company was a business, and the Bigger Bodies Initiative was presented as a solution to declining profits and failed experiments. The decision to establish an orphanage was partly motivated by the need for experimental subjects, but it was also presented as a way to improve the company's public image and potentially reduce costs. The experiments themselves were seen as potential products, living toys that could revolutionize the market and secure the company's dominance. The suffering of children was justified in the minds of the company's leadership by the potential for profit and success. This critique of capitalism and corporate ethics is subtle, but present throughout the narrative. Playtime Company represents a company that has lost sight of its original mission and values, that has become so focused on profit and growth that it is willing to commit atrocities to achieve its goals. The company's leadership viewed children as resources to be exploited, rather than as people deserving of protection and care. This dehumanization is a necessary precondition for the kind of systematic abuse that the Bigger Bodies Initiative represented. The workers at Playtime Company, who were not directly involved in the experiments, represent another aspect of this critique. These individuals were likely ordinary people who needed jobs and who believed they were working for a legitimate toy company. They may have had no idea about the experiments or the abuse of children, but their labour contributed to the company's success and helped maintain the facade that allowed the Bigger Bodies Initiative to continue. This raises questions about complicity and responsibility. about what workers owe to the companies they work for and what they should do when they suspect wrongdoing. The symbolism of toys as the form that the experiments take is rich with meaning. Toys are objects that children form emotional attachments to, that represent comfort and security, that are associated with play and happiness. By transforming children into living versions of toys, the Bigger Bodies initiative perverted these associations, turning objects of comfort into sources of horror. The experiments are living reminders of how something innocent can be corrupted, how the familiar can become strange and threatening. The specific toy characters that were chosen as templates for the experiments also carry symbolic weight. Huggy Wuggy, designed to be huggable and comforting, became a predator that crushes and kills. Mommy Longlegs, designed to be playful and entertaining, became unstable and violent. Catnap, designed to help children sleep peacefully, became a weapon that induces nightmares and death. Each experiment represents an inversion of its original purpose, a corruption of the values and intentions that the toy was supposed to embody. The Smiling Critters as a group represent a particularly pointed commentary on forced happiness and the performance of joy. These characters are defined by their giant smiles, their cheerful appearances, and their positive personalities. But the living versions of these characters are trapped in bodies that force them to maintain these appearances even as they suffer. They must smile even when they are in pain, must appear cheerful even when they are traumatized. This forced performance of happiness mirrors the way that victims of abuse are often expected to maintain appearances and hide their suffering. The factory's transformation from a place of production to a place of imprisonment represents another symbolic element. The factory was built to create toys, to produce objects that would bring joy to children, but it became a prison for the experiments, a place where they are trapped and unable to escape. This transformation mirrors the way that the experiments themselves were transformed from children with potential and futures into beings trapped in artificial bodies. The factory and the experiments share a parallel trajectory from creation and purpose to decay and imprisonment. The passage of time in the story is significant. The 10 years between the hour of joy and the player's return allowed the factory to decay, the experiments to adapt to their new reality, and the outside world to move on without knowing the truth. This time gap creates a sense of abandonment and isolation, emphasizing how completely the factory and its inhabitants have been cut off from normal society. The experiments have had a decade to think about what happened to them, to develop their own cultures and hierarchies, and to become something different from what they were immediately after their transformation. The mystery of who sent the VHS tape that brought the player back to the factory is one of the story's most intriguing unanswered questions. The tape suggests that someone or something wanted the player to return, that their presence in the factory serves a purpose for someone's plan. Poppy is an obvious suspect as she needed someone to free her from her case. But the prototype is also a possibility, as it has demonstrated a willingness to manipulate others to achieve its goals. The identity of who sent the tape and why will likely be a significant revelation in the story's conclusion. The player's survival skills and resourcefulness are remarkable, suggesting that they have training or experience that goes beyond what a typical office worker would possess. Their ability to solve complex puzzles, operate specialized equipment, evade dangerous experiments, and navigate the factory's hazards all suggest someone with significant capabilities. This supports theories that the player was not just an ordinary employee, but someone with a specific role or position that required these skills. The experiment's varying levels of intelligence and awareness raise questions about the success rate of the bigger body's initiative. Some experiments, like the Prototype, Poppy and the named characters, clearly retained high levels of intelligence and consciousness. Others, particularly the smaller experiments, seem to have lost much of their human awareness and operate more on instinct. This variation suggests that the transformation process was not always successful in preserving consciousness, that some subjects were reduced to little more than aggressive animals, while others retained their full mental faculties. The ethical implications of creating conscious beings through experimentation are profound. The experiments did not choose to exist, did not consent to their transformation, and have no control over their fundamental nature. They're trapped in bodies they did not choose, with capabilities and limitations they did not select, forced to exist in a form that is alien to their original identity. This raises questions about the responsibility that creators have to their creations, about what is owed to beings who are brought into existence without their consent. The concept of family is another important theme in Poppy Playtime. Elliot Ludwig lost his family through divorce and death, leading him to create Playtime Company as a substitute. The orphans at Playcare had lost their families and were seeking new connections and belonging. The experiments transformed from these orphans, lost their human families permanently and had to create new forms of family and community among themselves. Mommy Longlegs' insistence on being called Mommy reflects a desire to create familial bonds even in the absence of biological family. The story explores how the loss of family and the search for belonging can drive people to desperate actions. The relationship between creator and creation is explored through multiple lenses in the story. Elliot Ludwig created Poppy from his daughter, attempting to preserve her, but ultimately creating something new and different. The researchers created the experiments from children, transforming them into beings that were no longer human. The prototype creates itself through the incorporation of other experiments' body parts, constantly evolving and changing its form. Each of these relationships raises questions about responsibility, ownership, and the rights of created beings. The factory's architecture and design reflect the mindset of those who built it. The public areas are designed to impress and delight, to create positive associations with the Playtime Company brand. The underground areas are designed for efficiency and control, with security measures and containment systems that prioritize keeping the experiments confined and manageable. The game station is designed to test and evaluate children while maintaining the appearance of fun and play. Every aspect of the factory's design serves the dual purpose of maintaining the public facade while enabling the private horrors. The use of colour coding and visual design to distinguish different areas and characters helps players navigate the complex environment while also contributing to the storytelling. Each major experiment has a distinct colour scheme and visual design that makes them immediately recognisable. Different areas of the factory have different aesthetic styles that reflect their purposes and the events that occurred there. This visual language helps communicate information efficiently while also creating a cohesive and memorable world. The sound design and music in Poppy Playtime contribute significantly to the atmosphere and emotional impact. The cheerful, childlike music that plays in some areas creates a disturbing contrast with the horror of the situation. The mechanical sounds of the factory, the footsteps of approaching experiments, and the ambient noises all contribute to a sense of constant threat. The voice, Acting for characters like Poppy, Mommy Longlegs, and Catnap brings personality and emotion to these beings, making them feel like real characters rather than just obstacles. The pacing of the story, with its alternation between exploration, puzzle solving, and chase sequences, creates a rhythm that maintains tension while also providing moments of relative calm. The player is never completely safe, but they are also not constantly under attack. This pacing allows for the discovery and absorption of story information, while also providing intense action sequences that test the player's skills and reflexes. The balance between these different types of gameplay creates a varied and engaging experience. The environmental storytelling in Poppy Playtime is particularly effective, with details in the environment telling stories without explicit exposition. The arrangement of objects, the state of different areas, the graffiti and markings left by experiments, and the personal items scattered throughout the factory all contribute to the larger narrative. Players who take the time to observe and interpret these environmental details are rewarded with a deeper understanding of the story and the characters. The mystery elements of the story, with their emphasis on uncovering hidden information and piecing together the truth, engage players in active interpretation and theorizing. The game provides enough information to support multiple theories about various aspects of the story, while leaving enough ambiguity to maintain mystery and debate. This approach encourages community discussion and engagement, with players sharing their interpretations and theories with each other. The horror of Poppy Playtime is effective because it is grounded in real-world fears and concerns. The abuse of children, the corruption of institutions meant to protect the vulnerable, the pursuit of profit at the expense of human welfare, and the dangers of unchecked scientific experimentation are all real issues that resonate with audiences. By exploring these themes through the lens of horror and fantasy, the game allows players to engage with difficult topics in a way that is emotionally impactful, but also somewhat distant from reality. The experiment's perspectives on their own existence vary widely, reflecting different ways of coping with trauma and loss. Some experiments, like Catnap, found meaning through devotion to the prototype, creating a religious framework that gave their existence purpose. Others, like Dog Day, maintained their original values and tried to do good despite their circumstances. Still others, like Mommy Longlegs, became psychologically unstable, unable to fully process what had been done to them. These different responses show that there is no single way to cope with extreme trauma, that individuals respond differently based on their personalities, experiences, and support systems. The question of whether the experiments can experience happiness or fulfillment in their current forms is poignant and difficult. They are trapped in bodies that are fundamentally alien to them, unable to experience many of the sensations and activities that made life meaningful when they were human. They cannot grow, change, or develop in the ways that humans do. They are isolated from normal society and unable to form the kinds of relationships and connections that humans need. Yet some experiments seem to have found ways to create meaning and purpose despite these limitations, suggesting that consciousness and awareness can adapt even the most difficult circumstances. The role of memory in the experiment's identities is crucial. They remember being human, remember their lives before transformation, remember the people they knew and the experiences they had. These memories are both a comfort and a torment, providing a sense of continuity and identity, while also highlighting everything they have lost. The experiments must constantly negotiate between their memories of who they were and the reality of what they have become, trying to maintain some sense of self despite the radical changes to their bodies and circumstances. The factory's systems and infrastructure, which were designed to be operated by humans, have had to be maintained by the experiments since the Hour of Joy. This has required the experiments to learn new skills and adapt to roles they were never intended to fill. Some experiments have become proficient at maintaining the factory systems, while others have simply allowed their areas to decay. This variation in how different experiments have responded to the practical challenges of survival reflects their different priorities and capabilities. The power dynamics among the experiments, with the prototype at the top of the hierarchy, create a social structure that mirrors human societies in some ways. There are leaders and followers, enforcers and rebels, those who accept the status quo and those who resist it. This social complexity makes the experiments feel like a genuine community, rather than just a collection of monsters, adding depth to the story, and creating opportunities for conflict and drama beyond simple survival horror. The experiment's relationship with the factory itself is complex. The factory is simultaneously their birthplace, their prison, and their home. It is the site of their greatest trauma, but also the only place they have ever known in their current forms. Some experiments have claimed specific areas as their territories, creating spaces that feel like home despite the horror of their origins. This attachment to place, even when that place is associated with trauma, reflects real psychological phenomena and adds authenticity to the characters. The question of what the prototype ultimately wants is one of the story's central mysteries. Its actions suggest a desire for power and control, but the ultimate purpose of that control remains unclear. Does the prototype want to escape the factory and enter the outside world? Does it want to create more experiments? Does it have some larger plan that has not yet been revealed? The prototype's intelligence and strategic thinking suggest that it is working towards some specific goal, but what that goal might be remains a subject of speculation. Poppy's opposition to the prototype suggests that she has a different vision for the future, but the specifics of her plan are also unclear. She has mentioned wanting revenge on those who tortured the experiments, but most of those people are already dead. She has suggested that she needs the player's help to accomplish something significant, but she has not fully explained what that something is. Poppy's reluctance to be completely honest with the player suggests that her plan might involve actions or consequences that the player would not willingly support if they knew the full truth. The player's agency in the story is limited in some ways, but significant in others. They are being manipulated by both Poppy and the prototype, guided towards specific goals that serve others' purposes, but they also make choices about how to respond to the situations they encounter, whether to help or harm the experiments they meet, and ultimately which side they will support in the conflict between Poppy and the prototype. These choices, while constrained by the circumstances, still matter and will likely determine the story's outcome. The theme of transformation runs throughout the story at multiple levels. The children were transformed into experiments, losing their human forms but retaining their consciousness. The factory was transformed from a place of production to a place of horror and imprisonment. Playtime Company was transformed from a beloved toy company to a criminal enterprise. Elliot Ludwig was transformed from an idealistic entrepreneur to someone whose legacy is defined by the suffering his company caused. These transformations are rarely reversible, highlighting the permanent consequences of choices and actions. The story's exploration of consciousness and identity raises philosophical questions that have been debated for centuries. If a person's consciousness is transferred to a new body, are they still the same person? What makes someone who they are? Their body, their memories, their personality, or some combination of these elements? The experiments in Poppy Playtime exist in a state that challenges conventional understanding of identity, forcing both the characters and the audience to grapple with these fundamental questions. The experiment's legal and moral status is ambiguous and complex. They were created through crimes committed against children, making their existence evidence of those crimes. But they are also conscious beings with their own rights and interests, not simply objects or evidence. They have committed acts of violence, including the mass murder of factory employees during the Hour of Joy, but those acts can be understood as self-defense or rebellion against oppression. How should society judge beings whose very existence is the result of crimes, but who are also victims themselves? The role of documentation in the story is significant. The VHS tapes, written documents, and other records scattered throughout the factory serve as evidence of what happened, preserving the truth even as those who created the records are dead. This documentation allows the player to piece together the story and understand the full scope of the Bigger Bodies initiative. It also raises questions about why this documentation was created and preserved. Were the researchers proud of their work, or did someone deliberately preserve evidence in hopes that the truth would eventually be discovered? The experiment's varying levels of hostility toward the player reflect their different perspectives and experiences. Some experiments attack the player on sight, viewing any human as an enemy or a threat. Others, like Poppy, see the player as a potential ally who can help achieve their goals. Still others might be indifferent to the player's presence, focused on their own survival and concerns. These different responses create a complex social landscape where the player must navigate not just physical dangers, but also the political and social dynamics among the experiments. The factory's isolation from the outside world has allowed the experiments to develop their own culture and norms separate from human society. They have created their own hierarchies, their own ways of communicating and interacting, and their own understanding of what is acceptable behaviour. This culture is shaped by their shared trauma, their unique physical forms, and their isolation from normal human contact. Understanding this culture is crucial for understanding the experiments and their actions. The theme of childhood lost is central to the emotional impact of the story. The children who became experiments had their childhood stolen from them, their potential futures erased, their opportunities for normal development destroyed. They were forced to grow up instantly, to deal with trauma and horror that no child should have to face, and to exist in forms that prevented them from ever experiencing the joys and milestones of normal human development. This loss of childhood is perhaps the most tragic aspect of the entire story. The experiment's awareness of what they have lost makes their situation even more tragic. They remember what it was like to be human, to have normal bodies and normal lives. They can imagine the futures they might have had if they had not been selected for transformation. This awareness of loss, this knowledge of what might have been, creates a form of suffering that goes beyond physical pain or even the horror of their current existence. It is the suffering of knowing that something precious has been taken from them and can never be recovered. The factory's various areas each represent different stages or aspects of the Bigger Bodies initiative. The lobby represents the public face of the company. the innocent facade that hid the truth. The game station represents the evaluation and selection process, the systematic identification of victims. Playcare represents the long-term exploitation and preparation of subjects. The underground laboratories represent the actual transformation process, the moment when children became experiments. Each area tells part of the larger story, and together they create a comprehensive picture of how the Bigger Bodies Initiative operated. The experiment's physical capabilities vary widely, reflecting the different purposes for which they were designed. Huggy Wuggy was designed for security and physical intimidation, giving him size, strength, and speed. Mommy Longlegs was designed to oversee children in the game station, giving her elastic limbs that allowed her to reach anywhere in the facility. Catnap was designed to help children sleep, giving him the ability to produce sedative gas. Each experiment's physical form reflects the role they were intended to serve, though many have adapted their capabilities for purposes beyond their original design. The transformation process itself, while never shown in complete detail, is suggested to be extremely painful and traumatic. The combination of surgical procedures, chemical treatments with poppy gel, and the integration of artificial components into living tissue would be agonizing. The psychological trauma of watching your body be transformed into something alien would compound the physical pain. That any of the experiments retain their sanity and humanity after such an experience is remarkable, and speaks to the resilience of consciousness and identity. The experiment's lifespans and aging processes are unclear. They appear to be essentially immortal, not aging or deteriorating in the way that normal humans do. This immortality is both a blessing and a curse. They will not die of natural causes, but they are also trapped in their current forms forever, unable to change or develop. The prospect of existing for decades or even centuries in their current state, isolated in the factory and unable to experience normal human life, is a form of eternal punishment. The role of hope in the story is complex. Some experiments, like Dog Day, maintained hope that things could improve, that the experiments could eventually find freedom and peace. Others, like Catnap, found hope in their devotion to the prototype, believing that serving this being gave their existence meaning and purpose. Still others, like Mommy Longlegs, seem to have lost hope entirely, existing in a state of despair and madness. The presence or absence of hope significantly affects how the experiments cope with their situation and how they treat others. The experiment's capacity for violence is significant and disturbing. During the hour of joy, they killed hundreds of people with brutal efficiency. Since then, some experiments have continued to be violent, attacking and killing anyone who enters the factory. This violence can be understood as a response to trauma and oppression, but it also raises questions about whether the experiments can ever be trusted or integrated into society. The violence they are capable of makes them dangerous, regardless of how sympathetic their origins might be. The question of forgiveness is central to any potential resolution of the story. Can the experiments forgive those who created them and the system that victimized them? Can society forgive the experiments for the violence they committed during the hour of joy? Can the player forgive themselves if they were complicit in the Bigger Bodies Initiative? Can Poppy forgive her father for creating her in the form she exists in? These questions of forgiveness are difficult and may not have clear answers, but they are crucial for any possibility of healing and moving forward. The experiment's relationships with each other are varied and complex. Some experiments formed genuine friendships and alliances, supporting each other through their shared trauma. Others became enemies, competing for resources or power within the factory. Still others remained isolated, avoiding contact with both humans and other experiments. These relationships reflect the diversity of the experiment's personalities and coping mechanisms, showing that they are individuals with their own preferences and social needs. The factory's security systems, which were designed to protect the company's secrets and control the experiments, have become obstacles that the player must overcome. These systems include locked doors, security cameras, power systems that must be manipulated, and various other technological barriers. The existence of such extensive security measures suggests that the company was aware of the dangers posed by the experiments and took steps to contain them, though these measures ultimately proved insufficient during the hour of joy. The experiment's knowledge of the outside world is limited and outdated. They have been isolated in the factory since 1995, with no contact with the outside world and no way to learn about how society has changed. Their understanding of the world is frozen in the mid-1990s, and they have no knowledge of technological advances, cultural changes, or historical events that have occurred since then. This isolation has made them increasingly disconnected from the world they once knew, adding another layer to their alienation and displacement. The player's journey through the factory can be seen as a descent into truth, a gradual uncovering of layers of deception and horror. Each area they explore reveals more about what happened. Each document they find adds to their understanding, and each encounter with an experiment provides new perspective on the tragedy of the bigger body's initiative. This journey of discovery is both enlightening and traumatizing, forcing the player to confront uncomfortable truths about the company they may have worked for and the society that allowed such abuses to occur. The experiment's dreams and aspirations, to the extent that they still have them, are shaped by their circumstances and limitations. Some might dream of escape and freedom, of finding a way to exist in the outside world despite their monstrous appearances. Others might dream of revenge against those who wronged them, though most of those people are already dead. Still others might simply dream of peace, of an end to their suffering, and an escape from the consciousness that makes them aware of their tragic situation. The factory's decay and deterioration serve as a metaphor for the corruption and moral decay that led to its downfall. Just as the physical structure is crumbling and falling apart, so too did the moral structure of Playtime Company crumble under the weight of its crimes. The rust, the broken machinery, the failing systems, all of these physical manifestations of decay mirror the ethical decay that allowed the bigger body's initiative to exist and flourish. The experiment's understanding of morality and ethics has been shaped by their experiences in ways that may differ significantly from normal human moral development. They have been victims of profound injustice, which might make them more sensitive to issues of fairness and rights. But they have also been forced to participate in or witness violence and cruelty, which might have desensitized them to suffering. Their moral frameworks are likely complex and potentially contradictory, reflecting the complicated circumstances of their existence. The role of technology in the story is ambivalent. Technology made the experiments possible, enabling the transfer of consciousness and the creation of artificial bodies. But technology also enabled the abuse, providing the tools that allowed the researchers to transform children into experiments. Technology is neither good nor evil in itself, but takes on moral significance based on how it is used, and for what purposes. The story suggests that technological capability must be balanced with ethical consideration, that the ability to do something does not mean it should be done. The experiment's potential for growth and change, despite their fixed physical forms, is an open question. Can they learn new things, develop new skills, change their perspectives and beliefs? The story suggests that they can, that consciousness remains dynamic even when trapped in a static body. Catnap's evolution from a frightened child to a fanatical devotee of the prototype demonstrates that the experiments can change psychologically, even if they cannot change physically. This capacity for change suggests that redemption and growth remain possible, even in the most difficult circumstances. The factory's location and its relationship to the surrounding community raise questions about how the Bigger Bodies initiative remained secret for so long. The factory was a major employer and a significant presence in the community. How did no one notice the orphanage or question what happened to the children? How did the company explain the need for such extensive underground facilities? The answers to these questions likely involve a combination of careful deception, compartmentalization of information, and possibly the complicity or willful ignorance of local authorities and community members. The experiment's sensory experiences in their new bodies are likely very different from what they experienced as humans. They may have enhanced senses in some areas and diminished senses in others. They may experience pain differently, or not at all. They may have new sensory capabilities that humans lack. These differences in sensory experience would affect how they perceive and interact with the world, adding another layer to their alienation from their human origins. The question of whether the experiments can reproduce or create new experiments is disturbing but relevant. If they can create more of their kind, then the population of experiments could grow over time, creating new ethical and practical challenges. If they cannot reproduce, then they are a finite population that will eventually dwindle as experiments are destroyed or choose to end their existence. The story has not addressed this question directly, but it has significant implications for the long-term future of the experiments. The experiment's relationship with their human memories is complex and potentially painful. These memories are all they have left of their human lives, but they also serve as constant reminders of what they have lost. Some experiments might cling to their memories desperately, using them to maintain a sense of identity and continuity. Others might try to suppress or forget their human memories, finding them too painful to bear. Still others might reinterpret their memories, creating new narratives that help them make sense of their current existence. The story of Poppy Playtime is ultimately a tragedy, a tale of good intentions corrupted by ambition and grief, of vulnerable children exploited by those who should have protected them, and of beings trapped in an existence they never chose and cannot escape. It is a story about the consequences of playing God, about the dangers of pursuing knowledge and power without ethical constraints, and about the resilience of consciousness and identity, even in the most horrific circumstances. The experiments represent both the victims and the legacy of the Bigger Bodies initiative. They are living evidence of the crimes that were committed, walking reminders of the children who were sacrificed for scientific ambition and corporate profit. But they are also individuals with their own thoughts, feelings and desires, beings who deserve consideration and compassion, despite their monstrous appearances and violent actions. The story challenges the audience to see past the horror and recognize the humanity that still exists within the experiments. The player's role in uncovering and potentially resolving this tragedy gives them significant moral responsibility. They have the power to expose the truth about Playtime Company, to help or harm the experiments, and to influence the ultimate outcome of the conflict between Poppy and the prototype. How they use this power will determine not just their own fate, but the fate of all the experiments, and potentially the legacy of Playtime Company itself. The factory stands as a monument to human cruelty and the corruption of innocence, a place where childhood wonder was transformed into nightmare fuel. Its halls echo with the voices of children who will never grow up, who were denied the chance to live normal lives and instead were transformed into creatures that exist in the space between life and death, human and artificial, victim and monster. The factory is both a crime scene and a tomb, a place where terrible things happened and where the consequences of those things continue to unfold. As the player continues their journey through the factory, uncovering more secrets and facing more dangers, they move closer to a confrontation that will determine the future of everyone involved. The conflict between Poppy and the prototype represents two different visions for what should happen to the experiments and the factory. Poppy's vision, whatever it might be, seems to involve some form of resolution or ending, a way to finally put the tragedy of the Bigger Bodies initiative to rest. The prototype's vision appears to involve continued control and domination, using the experiments as tools to achieve its own goals. The choice between these two visions, or the possibility of finding a third option, will likely define the story's conclusion. The player must decide who to trust, what outcome they want to support, and what they are willing to sacrifice to achieve that outcome. These decisions are complicated by the fact that neither Poppy nor the prototype has been completely honest about their intentions, and both have demonstrated a willingness to manipulate the player to achieve their goals. The experiments themselves, caught between these competing visions, must also make choices about their own futures. Some may choose to support Poppy, believing that her plan offers the best chance for peace or justice. Others may remain loyal to the prototype, either out of genuine devotion or fear of the consequences of betrayal. Still others may try to remain neutral, simply trying to survive regardless of who ultimately wins the conflict. These choices will shape the final confrontation and determine which experiments survive and which do not. The revelation of the truth about Playtime Company to the outside world seems inevitable at this point. The player's presence in the factory and their documentation of what they find will eventually lead to exposure of the Bigger Bodies initiative and the crimes that were committed. How society responds to this revelation will be crucial for determining the experiment's ultimate fate. Will they be seen as victims deserving of compassion and support, or as monsters that need to be destroyed? Will there be attempts to help them, or simply to eliminate the evidence of the crimes that created them? The legacy of Elliot Ludwig and Playtime Company will be forever tainted by the revelation of the Bigger Bodies initiative. What was once a beloved toy company that brought joy to children will be remembered as a criminal enterprise that exploited and destroyed vulnerable children. Ludwig's original vision of creating toys that would bring happiness will be overshadowed by the horror of what his company became. This transformation of legacy from positive to negative mirrors the transformation of the children into experiments, showing how good intentions can be corrupted and how reputations can be destroyed by the revelation of hidden crimes. The question of justice for the victims of the Bigger Bodies initiative is complex and difficult. The children who are transformed into experiments can never be restored to their original forms, can never reclaim the lives that were stolen from them. The employees who were killed during the hour of joy can never be brought back. The families who lost children to the orphanage and never knew what happened to them can never have that closure. Justice in any traditional sense seems impossible, as the primary perpetrators are dead and the damage that was done cannot be undone. Yet some form of accountability and recognition seems necessary. The truth about what happened needs to be acknowledged, the victims need to be remembered, and society needs to grapple with how such atrocities were allowed to occur. The experiments themselves need some form of resolution, whether that means finding a way for them to live peacefully, helping them end their suffering, or something else entirely. Justice may not be possible in a traditional sense, but some form of moral reckoning seems essential. The experiment's capacity for forgiveness and healing is uncertain. They have suffered tremendously and have every right to be angry and resentful. Some experiments, like Catnap, channeled their trauma into violence and fanaticism. Others, like Dog Day, tried to maintain their moral values and treat others with compassion despite their own suffering. Whether the experiments as a group can move past their trauma and find some form of peace depends on many factors, including whether they receive support, whether they can find meaning and purpose in their existence, and whether they can let go of their anger and desire for revenge. The player's own healing and resolution is also important. If they were complicit in the bigger body's initiative, they need to find a way to atone for their actions and make amends for the harm they caused or allowed. If they were innocent or opposed the experiments, they need to process the trauma of what they have witnessed and experienced in the factory. Either way, the player's journey through the factory is transformative, changing their understanding of themselves, their past, and their moral responsibilities. The story of Poppy Playtime serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ambition, the importance of ethical constraints on scientific research, and the need to protect vulnerable populations from exploitation. It shows how good intentions can be corrupted, how secrecy can enable abuse, and how the pursuit of knowledge and profit without moral consideration can lead to atrocity. These lessons are relevant not just within the fictional world of the game, but in the real world as well, where similar dynamics of power, exploitation, and moral compromise continue to play out. The experiment's existence raises profound questions about the nature of humanity and what it means to be a person. They have human consciousness and memories, but non-human bodies. They were created through crimes, but are not themselves criminals simply by virtue of existing. They are capable of both compassion and violence, of moral reasoning and terrible cruelty. They challenge simple categories and force us to think more deeply about what defines personhood and what rights and considerations all conscious beings deserve. The factory itself, as a physical space, will likely need to be dealt with in some way. It cannot simply be left standing as it is, filled with experiments and evidence of crimes. Whether it should be preserved as a memorial, destroyed to eliminate the evidence, or transformed into something else entirely is a question that will need to be answered. The factory is both a crime scene that should be investigated and documented, and a place of such horror that many might prefer to see it erased from existence. The technological knowledge gained through the Bigger Bodies initiative presents an ethical dilemma. This knowledge was obtained through horrific means, but it represents genuine scientific breakthroughs that could potentially be used for beneficial purposes. Should this knowledge be preserved and studied, Or should it be destroyed to ensure it can never be used again? Can knowledge gained through unethical means ever be separated from its origins and used for good? These questions have real-world parallels in debates about research conducted by Nazi scientists and other historical examples of knowledge gained through atrocity. The experiment's potential contributions to society, if they could somehow be integrated, are significant. They possess unique capabilities and perspectives that could be valuable. They have survived experiences that would destroy most people, demonstrating remarkable resilience. They have knowledge about consciousness, identity, and existence that could advance human understanding. But realizing this potential would require society to accept them despite their appearances and their violent past, which seems unlikely given human nature and the horror of their origins. The story's exploration of corporate responsibility and accountability is particularly relevant in the modern era. Playtime Company represents a company that prioritized profit and growth over human welfare, that used secrecy and compartmentalization to hide its crimes, and that exploited vulnerable populations for its own benefit. These are not just fictional problems, but real issues that continue to affect society. The story serves as a reminder of the importance of transparency, oversight, and ethical business practices. The experiment's struggle for autonomy and self-determination is central to their character arcs. They were created without their consent, transformed against their will, and forced to serve purposes they did not choose. Their rebellion during the hour of joy was an assertion of autonomy, a refusal to continue being used as tools by others. But true autonomy requires more than just freedom from oppression. It requires the ability to make meaningful choices about one's own life and future. Whether the experiments can achieve this kind of autonomy remains to be seen. The role of witnesses and documentation in preserving truth is highlighted throughout the story. The VHS tapes, documents, and other records scattered throughout the factory serve as evidence of what happened, ensuring that the truth cannot be completely erased or denied. The player, as a witness to the current state of the factory and the experiments, has a responsibility to document and share what they have learned. This theme emphasizes the importance of bearing witness to injustice and ensuring that victims are not forgotten. The experiment's relationships with their own bodies are complex and often troubled. They are trapped in forms that are alien to them, that do not match their self-image or their memories of what they once were. Some experiments may have adapted to their new bodies and learned to use their capabilities effectively. Others may remain uncomfortable or distressed by their physical forms, experiencing a form of body dysmorphia that can never be resolved. This disconnect between consciousness and physical form is a source of ongoing suffering for many experiments. The question of whether the experiments have souls or spiritual existence beyond their physical forms is philosophical and potentially religious. If consciousness can be transferred between bodies, what does that say about the nature of the soul? Are the experiment souls the same as they were when they were human? Or were they fundamentally changed by the transformation process? These questions may not have definitive answers, but they are important for understanding how the experiments view themselves and their place in the universe. The factory's eventual fate will likely be determined by the outcome of the conflict between Poppy and the prototype. If Poppy succeeds in her plan, whatever it might be, the factory might be destroyed or transformed in some way. If the prototype maintains control, the factory might continue to exist as it has, a prison for the experiments and a monument to the crimes that created them. A third possibility is that the player finds a way to resolve the situation that neither Poppy nor the prototype anticipated, creating a new outcome that serves the interests of the experiments rather than the agendas of their would-be leaders. The experiment's capacity for love, friendship, and other positive emotions despite their trauma is a testament to the resilience of consciousness and the fundamental human need for connection. Even in the most horrific circumstances, some experiments maintain the ability to care about others, to form bonds, and to act with compassion. This capacity for positive emotion and connection suggests that healing and redemption are possible, even for beings who have suffered as much as the experiments have. The story's pacing and structure, with its gradual revelation of information and escalating confrontations, creates a narrative arc that builds toward a climactic resolution. Each chapter adds new information, introduces new characters, and raises the stakes for the player and the experiments. This structure maintains tension and engagement, while also allowing for character development and thematic exploration. The story is not just about surviving horror, but about understanding the causes and consequences of that horror. The experiment's understanding of death and what might come after is shaped by their unique existence. They have already experienced a form of death, the death of their human bodies and their human lives. They exist in a liminal state between life and death, neither fully alive in a traditional sense nor completely dead. This experience might give them a different perspective on mortality and what it means to truly die. Some experiments might welcome death as a release from their suffering, while others might fear it as a final loss of the consciousness that is all they have left of their original selves. The player's ultimate decision about what to do with the knowledge they have gained will have far-reaching consequences. They could choose to expose everything, bringing the truth about Playtime Company to light and forcing society to confront what happened. They could choose to keep the secret, protecting the experiments from discovery, but also allowing the crimes to remain hidden. They could choose to help the experiments in some way, either by supporting Poppy's plan or by finding an alternative solution. Each of these choices has moral implications and practical consequences that the player must weigh carefully. The experiment's potential for artistic expression, creativity, and other forms of self-actualization is an interesting question. Despite their monstrous forms and traumatic origins, they remain conscious beings with the capacity for thought, feeling, and expression. Some experiments might find ways to create art, music, or other forms of expression that help them process their experiences and communicate their inner lives. This capacity for creativity would be another sign of their retained humanity and their potential for growth and development. The story's themes of loss, grief, and the search for meaning resonate on multiple levels. Elliot Ludwig lost his daughter and tried to preserve her through technology, creating Poppy but also losing her in a different way. The children lost their humanity when they were transformed into experiments, losing their bodies, their futures, and their place in the world. The experiments lost their human lives and must find new ways to create meaning and purpose in their current existence. These layers of loss create a profound sense of tragedy that permeates the entire narrative. The experiment's memories of their human lives may fade over time as decades pass and the distance from their original existence grows. This gradual loss of memory would be another form of death, a slow erasure of who they once were. Some experiments might fight to preserve their memories, clinging to every detail of their human lives. Others might welcome the fading of memories that are too painful to bear. The question of whether it is better to remember or to forget is one that each experiment must answer for themselves. The factory's underground location and hidden nature reflect the secrecy and shame associated with the Bigger Bodies initiative. The experiments were literally buried, hidden away from the world where no one could see what had been done to them. This physical concealment mirrors the psychological and moral concealment that allowed the abuse to continue. Bringing the experiments and the truth about them into the light would be both a literal and metaphorical act of exposure, forcing acknowledgement of what was hidden. The experiment's potential for redemption depends partly on their own choices and actions, but also on whether they're given opportunities for redemption. If they are simply destroyed or imprisoned without any chance to demonstrate growth or change, then redemption becomes impossible. But if they are given opportunities to make amends, to help others, or to contribute positively to the world, then redemption becomes possible. The question is whether society would be willing to give them such opportunities, given the horror of their origins and their violent past. The story's ending, whatever form it takes, will need to address the fundamental questions that have been raised throughout the narrative. What should happen to the experiments? How should society respond to the revelation of the Bigger Bodies initiative? What is the player's ultimate role and responsibility? What is the fate of Poppy and the Prototype? These questions do not have easy answers, and any resolution will likely involve difficult choices and moral compromises. The experiment's legacy, regardless of what happens to them individually, will be significant. They are evidence of what humans are capable of, both in terms of scientific achievement and moral failure. They demonstrate the resilience of consciousness and the capacity for survival in even the most horrific circumstances. They raise important questions about identity, personhood, and the ethics of creation. Their existence will force society to grapple with difficult issues that might otherwise be ignored or avoided. The player's transformation through their journey in the factory mirrors the physical transformations that created the experiments. The player enters the factory as one person and will leave, if they leave, as someone fundamentally changed by what they have witnessed and experienced. This psychological and moral transformation is as significant as the physical transformations that created the experiments, showing that change and loss of innocence can occur in many forms. This is the complete timeline of Poppy Playtime, a story that spans decades and encompasses tragedy, horror, and the enduring question of what it means to be human. From Elliot Ludwig's founding of Playtime Company in 1930 to the player's current journey through the abandoned factory, every event has contributed to a narrative that explores the darkest aspects of human ambition and the resilience of consciousness in the face of unimaginable horror. The story continues to unfold, with each new chapter adding depth and complexity to this tale of innocence corrupted, children transformed, and the terrible consequences of playing God with human life.